Section 1. The Missing Years, Springfield's Frozen Timeline, and the People Trapped Inside It. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since the 17th of December, 1989. He was 10 when the Berlin Wall came down. He was 10 during the Gulf War. He was 10 when the internet arrived, when smartphones were invented, when social media reshaped the entire planet, when a global pandemic shut down civilization for 2 years. He was 10 through all of it. He will be 10 tomorrow. He will be 10 in whatever year you happen to be watching this. The number on Bart's birthday cake has never changed, and it never will, and Springfield has never once paused to ask why. Lisa Simpson is 8, Maggie Simpson is 1, Homer and Marge are somewhere in their mid-30s, though the show has quietly revised that number so many times across so many decades that pinning it down precisely has become its own kind of impossible task. The family on Evergreen Terrace is frozen, not in the way that old photographs freeze people, capturing a single moment and preserving it behind glass. The Simpsons are frozen while the world around them keeps moving. They interact with current technology. They reference current events. They live in the present tense of whatever year the episode airs. And yet, they never age a single day. They are permanent. They are fixed. They are the one constant in a universe that refuses to hold still for anything else. The television industry has a phrase for this. They call it a floating timeline. The idea is simple enough on the surface. The show's present is always the viewer's present, which means the characters can make jokes about whatever is happening in the news this week without those jokes aging poorly 3 seasons from now. Because by 3 seasons from now, the characters will still be the same age they are today. And the show can simply pretend the earlier cultural references happened at a different point in the family's life. The timeline floats because it has to. Lock it down, and every joke becomes a historical artifact. Let it drift, and the show stays perpetually current. Most animated series use some version of this approach. South Park does it, Family Guy does it, Bob's Burgers does it. The audience understands the convention and accepts it without much friction, because cartoons have always asked for a certain amount of imaginative cooperation from the people watching them. You understand that the characters aren't real, that the world isn't real, and that you're being invited to inhabit a kind of pleasant shared fiction for 22 minutes at a time. The floating timeline is just one more piece of that fiction. But The Simpsons has been running for so long, and the floating timeline has been operating for so many years, that it has started to produce consequences that no other show has ever had to face. Because when you run the floating timeline for 36 years, things begin to break in ways that are genuinely strange. Not strange in the way that a cartoon is strange. Strange in the way that a mathematical proof breaks when you push it past the limits it was designed for. Consider the most fundamental problem. Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s. They have been in their mid-30s since 1989. If they are still in their mid-30s today, then they were born sometime around 1985 or 1990, which means they were children when the original episodes of The Simpsons aired, which means the high school courtship that the show depicted in its earliest flashback episodes, the one with the bell-bottoms and the AM radio and the cultural fingerprints of the late 1970s, could not have happened to the versions of Homer and Marge that currently exist on the show. The past the show told you about, in the first decade of its run, no longer belongs to the characters you are watching right now. Their history has been quietly replaced, like a set of false teeth swapped in overnight without anyone mentioning it. The show has handled this through revision. In earlier seasons, Homer and Marge's backstory was anchored to the 1970s. Homer had a specific kind of loping, slightly dazed quality that felt appropriate for a man who came of age during that particular era, who listened to that particular music, who wore those particular clothes and absorbed those particular cultural values. His counterculture adjacency made sense. Marge's quiet domesticity in contrast to the world happening outside their windows made sense. The whole origin story had a specific texture that felt authentic to a moment in American history. Then that moment became too far in the past for the current ages of the characters to sustain, so the show revised it. In later flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's formative years shifted into the 1980s. The wallpaper changed, the music changed, the references changed. Homer went from being a young man on the periphery of the counterculture to being a young man in the era of hair metal and Reagan. Different texture, same emotional beats, same love story, same family forming in the same house, just transplanted. relocated in time without anyone announcing the relocation. Then the 1980s became too far back, so the revision happened again. And it will happen again. Every decade or so, Homer and Marge's youth gets quietly moved forward by roughly 10 years. Their memories updated like a software patch, the specifics of their adolescence quietly overwritten to maintain the plausibility of their current ages. They have been hippies, they have been grunge fans, they have been part of the early internet generation. And with each revision, something gets lost, not just the specific cultural details, but the internal consistency that makes a fictional world feel real. Characters are supposed to be built from their histories. Take away the fixed history, and what you have left is a shell performing the same emotional functions in increasingly different costumes. The show is aware of this. The writers know it. The audience at some level knows it too, even if most people haven't articulated it in exactly these terms. The floating timeline creates a specific kind of dizziness when you stare at it too long. A sense that the ground beneath Springfield is not solid but fluid, constantly shifting, never quite where you thought it was. And here is the detail that makes the whole thing genuinely unsettling, rather than just philosophically interesting. The show can imagine its characters aging. It has done so, deliberately, in some of the most emotionally resonant episodes it has ever produced. Season 6's Lisa's Wedding takes the audience 20 years into the future and shows Lisa at 23, engaged to be married, living in a world that has changed while her family has stayed exactly as she left them. The future episode is warm and melancholy and full of specific, lived-in detail about who Lisa has become and what that becoming has cost her. It is one of the most genuinely adult things the show has ever attempted, and it works precisely because it allows the characters to exist in time the way real people do, accumulating experience and consequence, and the particular weight of years. Then the episode ends, and Lisa is 8 again. Not in a dramatic reset, not with any acknowledgement of what just happened. The floating timeline simply absorbs the glimpse of the future and continues as if it never occurred. The show demonstrated that it could imagine growth and then chose not to allow it. And this choice, repeated across 36 seasons, across hundreds of flash-forward episodes and what-if scenarios and alternate reality stories, each one showing you who these characters could become if time were allowed to touch them, has produced something that is not quite tragedy and not quite comedy. It is something more like a sustained ache, the feeling of watching people who are perpetually on the verge of becoming someone and never quite arriving. The question nobody has ever satisfactorily answered is, why? Not why the show uses a floating timeline. That reason is practical and well understood. The deeper question is why the floating timeline in this particular show, applied to these particular characters over this particular span of time, feels so different from every other show that uses the same device. Why does it feel like something is wrong in Springfield in a way that it does not feel wrong in South Park or Family Guy or any of the other animated series that operate on similar principles? Part of the answer is duration. No other animated series has been running continuously for long enough to expose the floating timeline's contradictions as thoroughly as The Simpsons has. The device only starts to crack when you apply sufficient pressure, and sufficient pressure requires sufficient time. 36 years of pressure has produced cracks that are visible from space. But there is another part of the answer, and it is the part that the various theories we will be exploring throughout this video attempt to address. The floating timeline in Springfield does not feel like a production decision. It feels like a symptom. It feels like evidence of something else, something structural, something embedded in the reality of Springfield itself rather than in the decisions of the writer's room. The characters do not feel like characters who happen to exist in a show with a floating timeline. They feel like people who are trapped, people who cannot age not because their creators will not allow it, but because something in their environment, something in the water or the air or the specific strange properties of the town they live in, has made the passage of time impossible for them. The theories disagree about what that something is. They offer different explanations rooted in different evidence and arriving through different logical pathways. But every single one of them converges on the same conclusion. Springfield is not a normal place. The rules that govern the rest of the world do not apply inside its borders, and the aging that does not happen, the time that does not pass, the memories that reset between episodes and the catastrophes that leave no permanent mark, all of it is not a feature of the storytelling. It is a feature of Springfield. Consider what happens when Springfield experiences something that should, by any reasonable standard, permanently alter the lives of the people who live there. The town has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times across the series. It has been sealed under a government-mandated containment dome. It has survived nuclear near misses, environmental catastrophes on a scale that would force any real community to relocate, and the literal blocking of the sun by a billionaire who decided he wanted a monopoly on electrical power. After each of these events, the show does something remarkable. By the following episode, everything is back to normal. The dome is gone, the disaster is gone. The catastrophe has left no visible mark on the town or its residents. The slate has been wiped clean, and nobody mentions what happened. Fans have spent 30 years calling this lazy writing, episodic storytelling, a consequence of producing 22 episodes a season for 3.5 decades, with rotating writing staffs that cannot possibly maintain continuity across that volume of material. And there is truth in that. The production realities of network television at scale make continuity difficult even under ideal conditions, and The Simpsons has never operated under ideal conditions in that sense. But the show itself, deep in its own bones, suggests a different explanation. It suggests that the forgetting is not incidental, that the reset is not an accident of production logistics, that Springfield's capacity to absorb catastrophe and return to baseline is not a bug in the show's code but a feature of Springfield's reality, an engineered property of the town itself, maintained through mechanisms that several of the theories we are going to explore will attempt to identify and explain. The floating timeline is not just a narrative device, it is the central mystery of The Simpsons. It is the thing that every fan who has ever spent more than superficial time with the show has bumped against and been unable to fully explain. It is the question at the bottom of everything else. Why does time not pass in Springfield? Why can the show imagine its characters growing but refuse to let them grow? Why has Bart been 10 years old since before most of the people watching this video were born? And why does that fact, when you sit with it long enough, feel less like a cartoon convention and more like something that should be investigated? The theories that follow are attempts to answer that question. They come from different directions. They use different evidence. They require different amounts of imaginative cooperation to fully accept, but they all take the frozen timeline seriously, as evidence rather than convention, as a clue rather than a given. Something stopped the clocks in Springfield. Something has kept them stopped for 36 years. And the most interesting question in the history of American animation is not who shot Mr. Burns or where Springfield is located or why Homer can survive being hit by a car. The most interesting question is simpler and stranger and more fundamental than any of those. Why is Bart still 10? And whatever stopped the clocks, whatever force or event or property of this particular town has suspended time for an entire population of yellow-skinned, four-fingered people who live under the shadow of a cracked nuclear reactor and seem congenitally unable to ask the most basic questions about their own existence, that force has been operating continuously for longer than many entire television series have existed. It started in 1989, and it has not stopped yet. And the clues to what it is have been sitting inside the show the entire time, buried in the episodes, embedded in the details, waiting for someone to stop watching the jokes and start looking at the scaffolding underneath them. So, that is what we are going to do. For the next several hours, we are going to stop watching the jokes. We are going to look at the scaffolding. We are going to take every major mystery, every significant fan theory, every buried storyline, and unresolved contradiction in 36 years of Springfield history, and pull at the threads until the picture underneath becomes visible. Some of what we find will be funny. Some of it will be genuinely unsettling. Some of it will change the way you watch this show for the rest of your life, assuming you survive the experience of learning how deep the rabbit hole actually goes. The clocks in Springfield stopped for a reason. Let's find out what it was. Before we go any further, drop a comment below telling me what time it is where you are and what city you're watching from. I want to know where this is landing. And if you are enjoying this so far, subscribe, because we are just getting started and it only gets stranger from here. Section 2. The radiation conspiracy burns, the plant, and what it has done to Springfield. There is a power plant at the edge of Springfield. You know this. You have always known this. It is in the opening credits, those two cooling towers steaming against the yellow sky, as familiar and unremarkable as any other piece of the Springfield landscape. The plant is where Homer works. It is where Mr. Burns counts his money and fails to remember his employees' names. It is a joke. It is a gag. It is the backdrop for Homer falling asleep at his console and nearly causing meltdowns that never quite materialize into actual disaster. The plant is part of the scenery, but the scenery has been trying to tell you something for 36 years. And the show has been laying the evidence in front of you with such patience and such consistency that the only reasonable explanation for why it has not been universally acknowledged is that Springfield's particular brand of collective numbness has somehow spread through the television screen and infected the audience along with the residents. So let's look at the plant the way it actually deserves to be looked at, not as scenery but as a crime scene. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It provides electrical power for the entire town. It employs a significant portion of Springfield's working population. And by every measurable standard the show has provided across hundreds of episodes, it is one of the most catastrophically mismanaged industrial facilities in the history of fiction, perhaps in the history of industrial facilities generally. A surprise inspection discovered 342 safety violations. Not 3, not 12. Not a concerning but manageable cluster of regulatory issues that could be addressed with a reasonable budget and a committed management team. 342. The estimated cost to bring the plant up to code was $56 million, which is a significant sum but not an impossible one for a billionaire of Burns's documented wealth. Burns declined to spend it. His reasoning, never stated explicitly but implied clearly enough through the show's characterization of him, was that acknowledging the violations would mean acknowledging their consequences, and acknowledging their consequences would mean confronting what those consequences had already done to the community living downwind of a facility that was never safe from the moment it opened. The violations are not minor administrative oversights. The show depicts them with a specificity that is genuinely remarkable when you consider that this is a cartoon comedy airing on network television. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into bodies of water. Radioactive waste being dumped onto children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on an office desk, sitting open to the air next to a half-eaten donut. Cooling towers patched with chewing gum rather than concrete. Luminous rats running through the facility's infrastructure, their bodies glowing with absorbed radiation. Visible evidence of what proximity to an unshielded reactor does to biological organisms over time. And then there are the skeletons. The show reveals at one point that there are human skeletons in the basement of the plant. Human remains in a working nuclear facility? And the show mentions this detail and immediately moves past it without ever explaining who these people were, how they ended up there, or why nobody in Springfield's law enforcement structure has investigated what appears to be evidence of at least several fatalities inside a building that is supposed to be regulated by the federal government. The bones are simply present. The show shows them to you and changes the subject, and Springfield goes on being Springfield. The person responsible for ensuring none of this happens, the man whose literal job description involves preventing a working reactor from poisoning an entire town, is Homer Simpson. The show's own creator has stated that Homer's IQ is approximately 55, which places his cognitive function in a range that would qualify as significant developmental disability in most clinical contexts. An episode in Season 12 reveals that Homer has been carrying a crayon lodged in his brain since childhood, a foreign object that has been physically suppressing his cognitive function for decades. He is a man who routinely sleeps at his workstation. He has caused multiple near-miss incidents through negligence and inattention. He once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core out of simple curiosity about whether the radiation would make it grow larger. That is the person standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. That is the choice Burns made when selecting the safety inspector for his facility. Not an accident, a strategy. We will return to this. The first piece of hard evidence that the plant is actively mutating Springfield's population appears in Season 2. His name is Blinky, and he is a three-eyed fish. Blinky is pulled from a river near the power plant, and the show treats his discovery as a news event, a scandal, something that the town's political class has to respond to. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as central evidence in an argument that Burns is poisoning the environment. Burns is eventually forced to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate that it is harmless, that three eyes do not indicate contamination, that the concerns being raised are overblown. The town watches him eat the fish. The gubernatorial candidate loses the election. Nobody conducts a follow-up study. Nobody tests the water in the river where Blinky was found. Nobody asks the question that should be on everyone's lips. If the fish that live in this river have developed an extrasensory organ in response to whatever the plant is releasing into the water, what is happening to the people who drink from the same water source? The answer is visible in every frame of every episode, if you know what to look for. Homer Simpson has 4 fingers on each hand. His skull is shaped in a way that does not correspond to any documented human anatomy. His eyes bulge in a manner consistent with thyroid conditions that can be triggered by radiation exposure. He has an IQ that places him in a category of cognitive function that would be unusual in any population, but becomes extraordinary as a case study when you consider that this is a man who has spent his entire adult life working in direct proximity to an active reactor core in a facility with 342 unaddressed safety violations, with no protective equipment beyond what the show depicts as comically inadequate. His body's tolerance for physical trauma is not a cartoon convention. The show is specific and detailed about what Homer can survive. He has been shot. He has been electrocuted with enough voltage to leave visible burn marks on his body. He has fallen off multiple cliffs and walked away from every impact. He has been struck by moving vehicles and continued the conversation he was having before impact. He has survived explosions at close range. He has been crushed under enormous weights. In any realistic context, Homer Simpson should have died several dozen times across the show's run. He hasn't. His body simply reconstitutes itself, absorbs the damage, and continues functioning. This is not presented as a superpower. It is presented as just how Homer is, quirky and indestructible in equal measure, a feature of his personality as much as of his biology. But when you frame it against the radiation theory, it becomes something more coherent and more troubling. Homer's body has been altered at a cellular level by decades of radiation exposure. The mutations that radiation produces are not always negative in every dimension. The same process that suppressed his cognitive function may have produced adaptations in other systems: enhanced tissue regeneration, unusual pain tolerance, a skeletal and muscular structure that responds differently to traumatic impact than a normal human body would. He is not indestructible because the writers decided he should be. He is indestructible because Springfield made him that way. Marge shows the same physical markers, the same bulging eyes, the same 4 fingers. And the hair, Marge's hair, is physically impossible under any conventional biological framework. It grows straight upward in a dense blue tower that she has maintained in exactly the same shape for 36 years, without visible product, without visible effort, defying gravity with a consistency that no known human hair structure can achieve. The show treats this as a character quirk, a visual gag, as unremarkable as Homer's weight or Bart's spiky cut. But Marge was briefly employed at the power plant. She worked in the same facility with the same violations and the same leaking radiation that Homer has been exposed to for his entire career. Her exposure, while shorter, happened during a period when her children were either young or not yet born. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie were all conceived and raised in a Springfield already permeated by whatever the plant has been releasing, and all 3 of them display the same physical characteristics: the spiky hair that holds its shape without product, the overbites, the eyes, the yellow skin that covers every single resident of Springfield and nowhere else on Earth. The yellow skin is the detail that makes the radiation theory click into place in a way that is very difficult to dismiss, because the yellow skin is not applied uniformly across the Simpsons universe. When celebrities appear in Springfield, when guest characters arrive from outside the town, they look different. Not different in a stylistic sense, not animated in a slightly different style because they are cameo appearances. They look structurally different. Their proportions are more naturalistic. Their eyes are shaped more like actual human eyes. Their skin is the appropriate color for their ethnicity rather than the flat, consistent yellow that covers everyone who lives in Springfield. The standard explanation for this is the art style. The Simpsons is drawn in a particular way, and the guest characters are drawn in a slightly different way to make them visually distinctive, to help the audience immediately identify who is a Springfield native and who is a visitor. That explanation is pragmatically accurate as a description of the animator's choices, but it papers over something that, within the internal logic of the show's universe, is genuinely significant. There is a visible, observable difference between people who live in Springfield and people who come from outside it. The people inside have yellow skin, 4 fingers, bulging eyes, and physical characteristics that deviate from normal human anatomy. The people outside look relatively normal. The line between inside and outside maps perfectly onto the line between contaminated and uncontaminated, between people who have been drinking the water and breathing the air under the cracked cooling towers, and people who have not. The animals provide confirmation. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has the same bulging eyes and the same deviation from normal canine anatomy that his owners display. The show has been telling you this since the beginning. Blinky has 3 eyes because of what the plant is releasing. The fish in the river are mutated. The dog on Evergreen Terrace is mutated. The people of Springfield are mutated. The show says this directly and then does not follow the thread to its conclusion, because following it to its conclusion would require Springfield to look at itself honestly, and Springfield is constitutionally incapable of doing that for reasons we will examine in detail later. Now consider what the Springfield movie makes explicit. The environmental contamination of Springfield eventually reaches a point so severe that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal agency operating within the fiction of the show's universe, determines that the town must be physically sealed under a containment dome to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the United States. The EPA's assessment is not that Springfield has a pollution problem that can be managed with regulatory intervention. Their assessment is that the entire town is so toxic, so fundamentally and comprehensively contaminated, that physical quarantine is the only appropriate response. Springfield is classified as an environmental hazard by the federal government of the United States. The town is a contamination zone, and everyone inside the dome when it goes up, every person who has been drinking that water and breathing that air and living within range of those cooling towers, was already inside the zone when the government drew the boundary. The dome does not create the contamination. It acknowledges a contamination that has already happened to everyone within the boundary. The residents of Springfield are not at risk of being poisoned. They have already been poisoned. The dome is a label placed on a condition that has been developing for decades. Burns has always known this. The evidence for Burns's awareness of what his plant has done to Springfield is distributed across multiple episodes with a consistency that suggests intentional storytelling rather than coincidence. Burns funds private medical research. He employs personal physicians who operate outside the public healthcare infrastructure that his plant's contamination has compromised. He undergoes weekly medical treatments so intensive that they cause his body to emit a visible green glow, a detail we will examine in depth in the section on his impossible longevity, but which is relevant here because of what it confirms. Burns understands radiation better than anyone in Springfield, not academically, personally. His own survival depends on managing radiation's effects in his own biological systems. He knows what uncontrolled radiation exposure does to living tissue because he has spent a century managing exactly that in his own body. He knows what his plant is doing to Springfield because he has seen it at work in himself and extrapolated with the intelligence of a man who has had over a century to think clearly about the economics and biology of his situation. And the incompetence of his safety inspector is not negligence. When German investors briefly purchased the plant in one episode, the first action they took after the acquisition was firing Homer. The second was commissioning a full assessment of what it would cost to bring the facility up to regulatory compliance. The figure they received nearly bankrupted them before they could even begin the work. Burns bought the plant back and rehired Homer immediately. A competent safety inspector would have the facility shut down within weeks of a serious evaluation. Homer ensures that never happens, not through malice, but through the far more useful mechanism of genuine incompetence. The violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over Springfield's power supply, its economy, and by extension, the daily existence of every person who lives within its borders. A population too cognitively impaired by chronic low-level radiation exposure to fully process what is being done to them. The crayon in Homer's brain is the show's most direct statement about this dynamic. When the crayon is removed and Homer's IQ rises to genius level, he becomes immediately capable of understanding his situation with a clarity that is genuinely uncomfortable for everyone around him. He sees the plant for what it is. He sees his employer for what he is. He sees Springfield for what it is. And the clarity makes him miserable in a very specific way, not just generally unhappy, but unable to function within the social and professional structures of his life, because those structures depend on a certain amount of not seeing that a functional intellect cannot sustain. So he has the crayon put back in. He chooses, deliberately and consciously, to return to the fog. And the show plays this as touching, almost sweet, a man who loves his family so much that he would rather be cognitively impaired than face the truth of the world around him. But the show is also being precise about something else. The choice is rigged. A man of Homer's intelligence, operating in Springfield with a full view of his circumstances, has no good options. The system is not designed to reward or even sustain a clear-eyed Homer. It is designed to require a foggy one. The radiation theory does not explain one mystery about The Simpsons. It explains the architecture of the whole show, why the characters look the way they do, why Homer survives what he survives, why nobody ages in the conventional sense. Because conventional aging requires cellular processes that have been fundamentally altered. Why the town forgets its catastrophes. Because the same exposure that altered the residents' physical biology has altered the neurological systems responsible for forming and retaining long-term memories. Why Burns is the only person in Springfield who seems fully aware of reality? Because Burns is the only person in Springfield who has access to treatments that actively manage his radiation exposure, rather than simply absorbing it passively. Springfield is not a quirky cartoon town. It is a contamination zone where people have been living inside the consequences of a preventable industrial disaster for so long that the consequences have become the baseline. The yellow skin is not an art style. The four fingers are not a production shortcut. The bulging eyes are not character design. They are symptoms. The plant is not background. The plant is the story. Every joke, every reset, every impossible recovery, every forgotten disaster traces back to those two cooling towers steaming on the horizon. The power plant built Springfield. The power plant broke Springfield. And Springfield cannot acknowledge either of those facts because the same thing that broke it took away its capacity to understand what happened. Section 3. Homer's Coma. The Dream That Never Ended. The 1st of April 1993. The date matters. Keep it in mind. On that date, the 18th episode of The Simpsons' 4th season aired on Fox. The episode was called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show, and it is remembered primarily as a vehicle for archival footage, the kind of low-budget placeholder that networks have always used to fill out seasons when production schedules get complicated. The premise was thin. Bart pulls a series of April Fool's pranks on Homer, each one escalating past the last, until he takes one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and has it placed inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens the can, the explosion is violent enough to hospitalize him. So far, so standard. Homer getting hurt is not unusual. Homer ending up in the hospital is not unusual. The show was 3.5 seasons old, and had already established that Homer's body was capable of absorbing extraordinary punishment without permanent consequence. This was a known quantity, a reliable source of physical comedy that the show returned to regularly. But then something different happened. While Homer lay in his hospital bed recovering from the beer can explosion, he noticed a vending machine across the room. He reached for it, trying to get a candy bar. The machine tipped. It fell. It landed on Homer with sufficient force to put him into a clinically documented coma. Not a cutaway gag, not a dream sequence framed as such, but a full, medically framed coma with a flatline, a hospital response, a family reaction, and a stated prognosis. The episode ends with Homer apparently waking up. Bart is at his bedside, tearfully confessing that the whole escalating series of pranks was his fault, and Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son in the manner that the show had already established as their primary mode of interaction. The family laughs. Homer laughs. The studio audience responds warmly. Everything returns to normal. The show tells you, clearly and without ambiguity, that Homer woke up. But in the final minutes of that same episode, before the credits roll, the show also tells you something else. Homer lost 5% of his brain function during the coma. 5%, gone permanently, destroyed by oxygen deprivation during the period of unconsciousness, never coming back. Homer is informed of this loss and responds by laughing, then immediately noting that he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming. Nobody finds it alarming. The episode ends. The Simpsons has continued for 32 more years since that date. Unless, according to the most discussed and most internally consistent fan theory in the show's history, it hasn't. The Homer coma theory is not new. Its origins are traceable to internet discussions from the early 2000s, eventually formalized by a Reddit user whose handle was Hard Topic A Name, in a post that laid out the argument with enough clarity and supporting evidence that it spread through Simpsons fan communities with the velocity of something that resonates because it fits. The basic premise is this: Homer Simpson did not wake up from his coma on the 1st of April 1993. Every episode that has aired since that date, all 30-plus seasons of increasingly surreal storytelling, every celebrity appearance, every impossible adventure, every cosmic coincidence, every narrative reset, is a dream being generated by the unconscious mind of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, losing brain function slowly while his family sits beside him and waits for him to open his eyes. The evidence is not thin. The evidence is genuinely substantial, and examining it carefully produces the specific quality of unease that accompanies a good theory. The feeling that you have been looking at something familiar for years and suddenly realized it has a shape you did not previously see. Begin with the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a specific kind of show. Not realistic? Exactly, it was always a cartoon. And it had always leaned into the surreal edges of cartoon logic when it suited the story, but grounded in recognizable human experience in a way that gave the comedy its specific texture. The early seasons dealt with Homer trying and failing to quit drinking, with Marge contemplating infidelity and deciding against it, with Lisa developing a crush on a substitute teacher who represented an alternative to the intellectual stagnation of Springfield, with Bart facing the real possibility of being held back a year in school and the shame that would come with it. These were domestic problems, economic anxieties, the particular stress of a working-class family trying to hold itself together through the ordinary pressures that families face. The show was sharp and funny and sometimes genuinely moving, but its frame of reference was the recognizable world. After the coma episode, the frame of reference begins to change. Not all at once, the shift is gradual enough in its early stages that most viewers absorbed it without consciously registering the transition. But in retrospect, the trajectory is clear and dramatic. Homer goes to space. Mr. Burns captures the Loch Ness Monster. Homer becomes the leader of a vigilante group. He joins a secret society with connections to the most powerful institutions in American life. He discovers that his mother, who he believed dead, is alive and living underground as a wanted radical. He meets God twice, in scenes that treat the encounter as more or less routine. He befriends celebrities at a rate that would be implausible for any individual, but becomes truly absurd when you account for the sheer variety of the encounters. The post-coma Simpsons is a fundamentally different show from the pre-coma Simpsons in ways that go beyond the natural evolution of any long-running series. Shows evolve, tones shift, writing staffs change. The specific satirical targets of a cultural moment are not the same from decade to decade. All of that is true, and none of it fully accounts for what happened to The Simpsons after Season 4. The escalation is too consistent, too directional, too clearly oriented toward the increasingly impossible and surreal for it to be explained purely by the natural drift of a creative enterprise over time. Something changed in Springfield when Homer went under, and the dream theory proposes a very specific explanation for what that something was. Consider the God conversation. 6 months before the coma episode, in the Season 4 premiere episode Homer the Heretic, Homer has a face-to-face conversation with God. The sequence is played for warmth and gentle comedy, Homer and God having the kind of relaxed theological discussion that you might have imagined was beyond the show's ambition when it started. God tells Homer during this conversation that Homer will learn the meaning of life, but not yet. His time, God says, is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline alignment is precise enough to be unsettling. God told Homer his time was nearly up, in a conversation that the show framed as a throwaway gag about Homer's theological idiosyncrasies. And 6 months later, Homer's conscious life ended. Under the coma theory, God was not making a vague spiritual promise about enlightenment. God was delivering a specific, accurate prophecy about the end of Homer's waking existence. The prophecy was accurate. Homer's time came on the 1st of April 1993. And everything that followed was the elaboration of a dream that began on the day a vending machine fell on a man who was already in a hospital bed after a beer can exploded in his face. The aging paradox finds its most elegant explanation in the coma theory. Every other framework for understanding Springfield's frozen timeline requires some external mechanism, Some property of the environment or the social structure or the physics of the town that prevents the passage of time from affecting the residents. The radiation theory requires cellular mutation on a scale that alters the aging process. The collective denial theory requires an active social agreement to ignore the evidence of time's passage. But the coma theory requires nothing external at all. Nobody ages in Homer's dream because Homer's mind does not have the material to age them with. He went under in April of 1993. At that moment, his children were the ages they were. His wife looked the way she looked. His friends and neighbors were frozen at their 1,993 versions in his memory. The dream draws on that memory, which is the only raw material it has, and it cannot imagine his children as teenagers or adults because he was not awake to see them become those things. His unconscious mind can only render what it knew. Bart is 10 because that is how old Bart was in the last conscious moment Homer recorded. Lisa is 8 for the same reason. Maggie is 1 because in Homer's last waking memory, Maggie was 1. The coma preserves his world at the exact moment of its last witness state. The celebrity appearances have an explanation too, one that is strange and touching and slightly clinical all at once. A person in a coma is not fully sealed off from external stimulation. Sound passes through. Voices from the television in the hospital room, conversations at the bedside, the radio playing at the nurse's station, all of it reaches the sleeping brain at some level of processing, filtered and transformed by whatever cognitive mechanisms continue to operate during unconsciousness. Homer's coma brain, receiving ambient stimulation from the world outside, hears names and voices and cultural references and incorporates them into the dream. It takes a fragment of a voice from a television program and assembles a character around it. It takes a name mentioned in a conversation at the bedside and builds an encounter in Springfield around that name. The flood of celebrity appearances in the post-coma seasons is not Springfield becoming a magnet for famous people. It is Homer's unconscious mind absorbing whatever leaks through from the world outside and weaving it into the dream with the indiscriminative logic of a sleeping brain that does not distinguish between important, unimportant input. The increasingly surreal quality of the post-coma seasons has an explanation as well, and it is the one that is most difficult to sit with comfortably. Dreams generated by a brain that is slowly deteriorating do not maintain their internal consistency over time. They drift. They become stranger. The narrative logic that holds the early scenes together becomes looser and more associative as time passes, and the underlying cognitive infrastructure continues to degrade. The Simpsons became progressively more surreal, not because the writers stopped caring about coherence, but because Homer's dreaming brain became less capable of producing coherent narratives. The Golden Age seasons are the product of a mind that is still relatively intact, spinning a dream that has texture and weight and emotional truth. The later seasons are the product of a mind that has been unconscious for 10, 15, 20 years, still dreaming but with reduced capacity for the kind of sustained narrative logic that the early dream maintained. The show itself has engaged with this theory directly. In season 34, an episode included a deliberately leaked fake deleted scene in which Homer wakes from a long coma and the reveal is that everything had been a dream. The scene was animated. It was fully produced. It was then explained as a hoax, a fake scene planted by outside parties, not a genuine reveal. The writers created the scene, showed it to the audience, and then wrapped it in a denial. But the denial is its own kind of confirmation. You do not animate a scene denying a theory unless the theory is coherent enough to require denial. You do not produce a fully realized version of the coma wake-up if the coma theory is so obviously wrong that it does not merit engagement. The season 34 moment tells you that the writers know the theory, understand why it holds together, and have chosen to neither fully confirm nor fully deny it, leaving it in the precise state of productive ambiguity that has characterized it since the original Reddit post. The executive producer who addressed the theory directly in 2015 said simply that it is not true. He offered no alternative explanation for why nobody ages. He did not address the tonal shift. He did not engage with the God conversation or the 5% brain loss or the specific date of the coma episode or any of the structural evidence that makes the theory feel like more than speculation. He said it is not true and the interviewer moved on. But the audience did not move on. Because a simple denial from a producer, however authoritative, does not actually close the question the theory raises. The question is not whether the writers intended the coma, The question is whether the coma theory provides a more coherent account of 36 years of Simpsons storytelling than any other available framework. And the uncomfortable answer, if you examine it honestly, is that it does. It addresses the aging paradox. It addresses the tonal shift. It addresses the celebrity flood. It addresses the increasingly surreal narrative logic. It addresses the reset button that erases consequences between episodes, because consequences do not accumulate across dreams the way they accumulate across waking experience. It addresses Homer's capacity to survive anything, because his body is not actually surviving anything. His body is in a hospital bed, and only his dreaming mind is in Springfield, and a dream cannot kill the body of the dreamer. And if the coma theory is true, then the emotional content of The Simpsons transforms completely. Not from good to bad, not from funny to tragic, but from one kind of story to a deeper one. Homer's deepest wish, the thing his dreaming mind returns to across thousands of episodes and 36 years of sleep, is extraordinarily simple. He wants his family. He wants Marge to still love him. He wants Bart to still be his mischievous, impossible, exhausting, wonderful boy. He wants Lisa to still play her saxophone in her room late at night when she thinks nobody is listening. He wants Maggie to be small enough to hold. He wants Friday evenings on Evergreen Terrace to continue indefinitely, the four of them on the couch in front of the television, annoying and loving each other in equal measure. The coma gives him this. The dream preserves everything he loves at the exact moment he lost consciousness, and it runs the preservation forward indefinitely, generating endless variations on the same essential scene. His family together, intact, safe, unaged, unharmed, Bart causing trouble and getting caught, Lisa arguing for something that matters, Marge making everything work through sheer patience and competence, Maggie watching it all from her perch in whatever room she happens to occupy, those enormous eyes taking in everything. The dream is not a prison. It is the only heaven a man like Homer Simpson would ever think to ask for. Every episode that ends with the family back together on the couch is Homer's unconscious mind insisting on what it cannot bear to release. Every impossibility that resolves into normalcy by the following week is Homer refusing to let the story arrive at its conclusion because the story's conclusion means something he is not ready to face. Every reset is an act of love in the form of refusal. The refusal of a dreaming father to allow the family he last saw in 1993 to move forward into a future where he cannot follow. Homer has been dreaming since April of 1993. He will dream for as long as his brain continues to generate the capacity for dreaming. And every Sunday night at 8, the dream puts him back on Evergreen Terrace, surrounded by the people who matter most to him, with nowhere they need to be and nothing that cannot be solved by the end credits. Whether or not the show intends for you to read it this way, this is what it has produced. A 36-year love letter from an unconscious man to the family he cannot reach. Section 4. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The case that was never closed. The summer of 1995 was, by any reasonable measure, a national event for American television. The Simpsons had been on the air for 6 seasons. It was at the absolute peak of its cultural saturation, the kind of show that people who did not watch television somehow still managed to have opinions about. The show that had redefined what animated comedy could do and was in the process of demonstrating that it could do things network executives had not previously believed were possible. And that summer, with the season 6 finale, the show attempted something that had never been done before by an animated series and has arguably never been done as well since. A genuine mystery. A real whodunit, structured with the care and intentionality of a detective story, built around a shooting victim, a town full of suspects, a set of clues deliberately embedded in the episode, and a summer-long wait before the resolution. Fox promoted it with the energy of a cultural milestone. America's Most Wanted produced a companion special, treating the fictional crime as if it were a real unsolved case. Viewers were invited to submit their theories in a national contest, the prize being animation into an actual future episode of the show. The Simpsons was not just a television program that summer, it was a puzzle that the entire country was working on simultaneously. The setup was meticulous. By the end of Part 1, Mr. Burns had positioned himself as the obvious target. He had drilled into Springfield Elementary's oil well, gutting the school's budget and destroying the one economic resource that Principal Skinner had been counting on. He had driven Moe's Tavern out of business by calling in a loan. He had created a sinkhole that collapsed the Springfield retirement castle. he had injured Santa's little helper. And for his grand finale, he had constructed a device capable of blocking the sun over the entire town, with the explicit purpose of forcing every resident to purchase their electricity from his plant because they would have no alternative light source. Burns had gone beyond routine villainy into something that felt genuinely personal to every single person in Springfield. When Smithers protested, Burns fired him on the spot, eliminating his most loyal ally and creating one more suspect with motive. The town meeting that followed was a study in barely contained collective rage. Multiple characters arrived with weapons. Every person in the room had been specifically personally damaged by Burns's escalating scheme. Homer because Burns had never once remembered his name despite employing him for years. Bart and Lisa because their school had been financially gutted. Grandpa because the retirement home he lived in had been physically destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie because he lost his job when the school lost its funding. Tito Puente because Burns cut the music program. Moe because his bar was gone. Smithers because he had just been discarded by the man he had spent his career serving. Then Burns collapsed, a single gunshot wound. He staggered onto the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two letters carved into its surface. From one angle, W and S. From Burns's own perspective, M and S. America spent the summer arguing about who did it. And here is the first problem. Essentially, nobody got it right. Fox's national contest gathered thousands of entries from viewers who believed, based on the show's explicit promise, that the clues embedded in Part 1 were sufficient to identify the shooter. The production team reviewed a randomly selected sample of those entries and found, according to the DVD commentary, that not a single person in that sample had guessed the correct answer. The prize was awarded to a randomly chosen entrant who had not identified the right shooter and who received a cash payment in lieu of the animated appearance they would otherwise have received. The one person known to have posted the correct answer publicly, on a Simpsons newsgroup the night the episode aired, was using a college internet account that had become inactive by the time the show's producers tried to track them down. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for that person to come forward. They appear never to have done so. What does this tell you? A show that designed a mystery, promised the audience it was solvable from available evidence, built a national promotional campaign around public participation in solving it, and then when the answer came out, found that the clues had not actually produced the expected result. Either the clues were insufficient, or the red herrings were too effective, or, and this is the possibility that the most interesting readings of this mystery take seriously, the answer that was eventually revealed does not follow logically from the evidence that was laid out. Let's look at the sundial. Burns falls and his hands land on specific letters. The show tells you these letters represent the initials of his attacker, M and S for Maggie Simpson. This is the central piece of physical evidence, the visual clue that is supposed to close the case in the audience's mind. But Burns himself, in a canonical on-screen statement, tells us that the positioning of his hands was not deliberate. He was falling. He was collapsing from a gunshot wound. He did not arrange his hands to spell out his attacker's initials. He fell, and his hands happened to land where they landed. The sundial clue is, according to the victim himself, a coincidence. The single most prominent piece of evidence in the mystery is, by the victim's own account, meaningless. The gun. Before the shooting, Burns is shown with a holster that is visibly empty. His gun was missing before the attack occurred. Whoever shot Burns used Burns's own weapon, which they either took from him during an encounter or found after he dropped it. This is important because it tells you something specific about the shooter's profile. Most of the suspects at the town meeting arrived with weapons of their own because they were angry enough to consider violence. The person who shot Burns was someone who was not armed when they arrived, who encountered Burns's gun by chance or by accident, and who used it impulsively rather than as part of a premeditated plan. A baby finding a gun on the ground fits this profile. The show's explanation that Maggie encountered Burns in a parking lot, that he attempted to take her lollipop, that his gun fell from the empty holster during the struggle, that Maggie picked it up and it discharged, is consistent with the empty holster and the unpremeditated quality of the shooting. But so does approximately a dozen other scenarios involving other characters. Burns's last words before being shot were, "Oh, it's you." He recognized his attacker. He said this with the tone of mild surprise, the way you might react to encountering someone you know in an unexpected context. Not fear, not alarm. The calm recognition of someone familiar. Does Mr. Burns recognize Maggie Simpson? The show does not establish any relationship between Burns and Maggie prior to this episode. Burns barely recognizes Homer, and Homer has worked directly for Burns for years. The idea that Burns would see a baby in a parking lot and say, "Oh, it's you," with the calm familiarity of recognizing an acquaintance strains credibility in a way that has bothered attentive viewers since the episode aired. In Season 18, Homer makes a casual on-camera statement claiming that he was actually the one who shot Burns. He says this without fanfare, without dramatic framing, without any apparent awareness that he is confessing to the attempted murder of one of the most powerful men in Springfield. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The confession is treated as either a throwaway joke or the kind of thing Homer says without full awareness of its implications. The show provides no resolution to this moment. Either Homer is lying for attention or comic effect, which is consistent with his character but requires you to dismiss a direct on-camera statement, or Homer is telling the truth, which means Maggie is innocent and the case was always wrong. The Marge theory, which circulates in various forms through Simpsons fan communities, deserves serious attention. Marge is a devoted mother who by the end of Part 1 had watched Burns systematically destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, and threaten the economic survival of her entire community. She had stronger emotional stakes in the situation than most of the named suspects. And the theory's most compelling element is its explanation for why Burns, waking from his coma, would identify Maggie rather than Marge as his attacker. The show established in an earlier episode, Marge Gets a Job, that Burns developed a significant infatuation with Marge. A man who harbored that kind of feeling, waking from a near-fatal shooting and seeing a face he recognized, a face he had feelings for, might make a choice. Protect her. Let the investigation find its own conclusion. Steer it toward an answer that cannot result in prosecution. And Maggie is the perfect answer in that context. Chief Wiggum says it explicitly in the episode's resolution. No jury in the world would convict a baby. An infant cannot be prosecuted. An infant cannot be imprisoned. An infant is the cleanest possible fall person available in Springfield's legal infrastructure. If someone with knowledge and motive needed the investigation closed without anyone facing actual consequences, pointing it toward Maggie achieves exactly that. The alternate endings prove that even the writers were not fully committed to the Maggie solution during production. A complete alternate version of the resolution was animated with Smithers as the shooter. Not a rough draft, not a storyboard, a full, completed, voiced alternate ending that was finished enough to be screened in the season retrospective special hosted by Troy McClure, who dismisses it by explaining that all the DNA evidence would have had to be ignored, which he calls downright nutty. The character then notes, in a wink that is almost too on the nose, that ignoring DNA evidence is something that happens in the real world too, a reference to the O.J. Simpson trial that was happening concurrently with the episode's production. The show is telling you, through Troy McClure, that official conclusions and correct conclusions are not always the same thing, that the evidence can be made to point wherever someone with enough influence wants it to point, that the verdict can be manufactured to protect the outcome that those in power prefer. And it is telling you this in the context of a mystery whose resolution the show has simultaneously committed to and surrounded with enough alternative evidence to make that commitment feel provisional. An early draft of the script had Barney Gumble as the shooter. The writers considered it seriously enough to develop it before abandoning it. The answer went through at least 3 iterations before landing on Maggie, which means the clues in Part 1 were not written with a predetermined answer in mind that the writers then constructed a mystery around. The mystery was written first and the answer was selected afterward, which means the clues are not specific to Maggie. They were designed to point in multiple directions, and then the production chose one of those directions and called it the truth. The official answer is Maggie Simpson. The writers stand behind it. The DVD commentary treats it as settled. And the show, whatever you might think of the logical gaps in the case, committed to that answer and never publicly walked it back. But the contest that nobody won, the sundial clue that Burns himself called coincidental, the alternate endings that were fully animated, Homer's unaddressed Season 18 confession, the "oh, it's you" that does not match the established relationship between Burns and Maggie, and the final shot of Maggie alone in a room, mimicking the pulling of a trigger, all of it together creates a file that does not close cleanly. The greatest mystery in Simpsons history was not solved. It was declared closed, and in Springfield, those two things have never been the same. Section 5. The Immortality of Mr. Burns, a Century of Engineered Survival. Charles Montgomery Burns should not be alive. This is not a comment about his character. It is not a comment about the quality of his choices or the moral weight of the things he has done across 36 seasons of television. It is a simple, biological, chronological statement. If the timeline the show has constructed around Burns is accurate and across dozens of episodes, from multiple angles, it has been remarkably consistent about certain specifics. Then Burns was born in the late 19th century. He has personal memories of events from before the First World War. He has described working relationships with historical figures who died before the majority of the show's current audience was born. He attended Yale. He served in the Second World War, in a capacity that the show makes clear was at minimum morally questionable and at maximum actively criminal. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during wartime and kept it hidden for decades, which requires both the institutional access to take it and the longevity to have maintained custody of it. By the most conservative possible reading of the show's own established timeline, Burns is well over 100 years old. By a more liberal reading of the specific historical references the show has made, he may be approaching 140. And at either age, he not only exists but functions at a level of cognitive and strategic sophistication that most people never achieve at any age. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He navigates municipal politics with the ease of someone who has been doing it for so long that the manipulations have become second nature. He devises schemes of genuine complexity, schemes that require sustained planning over time, an understanding of modern financial and legal systems, and the ability to anticipate and counter the moves of adversaries who are younger and, in many respects, more conventionally capable than he is. Burns is not just old. Burns is old and sharp. Whatever has kept his body functioning past the century mark has not compromised the mind inside it. His intelligence is one of the most consistent and reliable facts the show has established about him, more consistent even than his cruelty, more reliable even than his inability to remember Homer's name. Burns is the most strategic thinker in Springfield by a margin that is not particularly close. The show addresses the question of how this is possible directly in one specific episode, and then immediately retreats from the implications of its own answer. In the Springfield Files, which we have already touched on in the context of the radiation theory, Burns undergoes a weekly medical regimen. The episode frames this as an explanation for why Homer saw a glowing figure in the woods near Springfield. Burns, after each treatment, wanders out of the facility in a dazed, post-treatment state, his body emitting visible light from the radiation he has just absorbed. The green glow that Homer interpreted as evidence of alien life is simply what Burns looks like immediately after the treatment that keeps him alive for another 7 days. The detail that matters is the time frame. 1 week. The treatment keeps Burns alive for exactly 1 more week, and then it needs to be repeated. Miss a dose, and Burns dies. The margin for error in his survival protocol is precisely 0. His continued existence is not a function of his own resilience or his genetic inheritance, or the natural hardiness of a wealthy man with access to good nutrition and medical care. It is an engineered outcome, maintained through a recurring intervention administered on a precise schedule, without which the biological machinery of his body would fail within 7 days. His body is kept alive the way you keep a mechanical system functional through regular scheduled maintenance, not through any inherent capacity for self-repair. And the maintenance involves radiation. Burns, who owns a nuclear power plant, who has profited from the radiation that his plant leaks into Springfield's environment for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to maintain his own biological functions. His body has been so fundamentally altered by its long proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain itself through conventional cellular processes. The radiation has replaced normal metabolic function with something else, something that requires continued radiation input to maintain its operation. Burns is not a person who profits from a nuclear plant. Burns is a person whose survival is powered by one. The Three Stooges syndrome, revealed in one of the show's most quoted medical scenes, provides the other half of the picture. Burns visits a doctor who informs him that his body hosts every disease known to medical science simultaneously. Every known human pathogen, every documented illness, every condition that can afflict the human body, all of them are present in Burns at the same time, existing in a state of perfect equilibrium. Each disease is being blocked from progressing by every other disease. They are all trying to kill him simultaneously, and because they are all equally present and equally aggressive, none of them can advance past the others. They create a gridlock that functions, paradoxically, as a kind of biological invincibility. Burns is the sickest man alive and also the most difficult man alive to kill, because the things that should kill him are all trying to do it at the same time. The doctor calls this Three Stooges syndrome. The audience laughs, the show moves on. But the radiation theory makes this diagnosis make sense in a way the comedy framing does not invite you to consider. The disease equilibrium is not naturally occurring. It is not a fortunate biological accident that happened to produce a sustainable outcome. The weekly radiation treatments are managing it. They are maintaining the precise balance between every illness in Burns's body, suppressing each one exactly enough to prevent it from gaining dominance without eliminating any of them. The treatments do not cure Burns. They keep every disease in stasis, balanced against every other disease, in a state of sustained gridlock that allows Burns to function despite carrying a body that should, by any conventional medical assessment, be dead. Burns's body is a reactor. His weekly treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control mechanisms to prevent a critical failure. Too much intervention in any one direction and the balance collapses. Miss a treatment entirely, and the entire system fails at once. This explains Smithers in a way that the show's framing of their relationship never quite gets to. Smithers is presented as devoted, perhaps unhealthily so, to Burns in a way that the show has explored from multiple emotional and comedic angles across its run. The dependency reads as psychological, as the product of whatever combination of professional loyalty and personal feeling Smithers has developed over decades of service. But under the medical framework that Burns's survival requires, Smithers's role is not primarily emotional. It is logistical. Smithers manages Burns's schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly treatment. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with the vigilance of someone who understands that a lapse in attention is not an inconvenience, but a death sentence. Without Smithers, Burns misses a dose. Without a dose, the disease equilibrium collapses. Without the equilibrium, Burns is dead within a week. Smithers is not devoted to Burns primarily out of love. He is devoted because he knows whether he has articulated this knowledge explicitly or carries it as a felt understanding that his absence is lethal. He is the single point of failure in Burns's survival infrastructure. Remove Smithers from the equation and the oldest man in Springfield is gone within 7 days. The historical depth of Burns's character provides additional texture to the immortality question that is worth sitting with. The Burns family, as the show has gradually revealed across its run, is not simply wealthy. It is dynastically wealthy, the kind of wealth that predates the Industrial Revolution, that was present at the founding of American economic institutions, and has been compounding inside those institutions ever since. The Simpsons depicts the Burns family tree as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful lineages in American history. They did not build an empire in the 20th century. They maintained an empire that was already ancient when Charles Montgomery was born. This kind of generational continuity does not happen by accident. It requires active, ongoing management political relationships that persist across administrations, financial structures that survive economic upheavals, legal arrangements that continue to function through changing regulatory environments. It requires someone at the helm who understands the full scope of what they are managing, which means someone who has been at the helm for long enough to accumulate the knowledge that scope requires. The Burns dynasty's continuity across centuries suggests that the mechanism keeping Charles Montgomery alive may not be unique to this particular Burns. Earlier generations of the family may have employed different means, pre-nuclear, pre-modern medical, but the same fundamental impulse: extend the lifespan of the person who controls the empire because the empire's continuity depends on it. The show does not explore this thread directly. It offers it as implication and then moves past it. But the implication is there. Burns's longevity is not anomalous within his family's history. It is the latest iteration of a pattern that predates the nuclear age by a considerable margin. And Springfield's relationship with Burns's continued existence has a specific and troubling economic logic. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns's continued operation of it. Burns's operation depends on his continued survival. His survival depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the infrastructure that his wealth provides. the private medical research facilities, the pharmaceutical division capable of synthesizing whatever the weekly regimen requires, the network of physicians and technicians who administer it. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system where the man, the machine, and the money feed each other continuously. Springfield cannot afford to let Burns die. Not in a moral sense, in a purely economic sense. The town is so thoroughly dependent on the plant that its removal would not simply be economically damaging. It would be existentially threatening. Remove Burns and the plant becomes unmanageable. Make the plant unmanageable and the power goes out. Make the power go out, and the economic infrastructure of Springfield collapses. Springfield is Burns's captive community, dependent on him for the electricity that runs every home and business in town, and that dependency has calcified over the decades into something that functions like a natural condition, something so fundamental to Springfield's reality that questioning it feels like questioning the weather. Burns built that dependency deliberately. He built it over a century, through choices that were always about maintaining control. The plant poisons Springfield. The poison impairs Springfield's capacity for resistance. The impairment ensures compliance. The compliance sustains the dependency. The dependency sustains Burns. Burns maintains the conditions that produce the impairment. It is a machine that has been running for 100 years and has never needed to be serviced because the product of its operation is the suppression of the capacity for the people affected by it to organize against it. Burns is not the oldest man in Springfield by accident. He is the oldest man in Springfield because he designed the town to require him and designed himself to outlast the town's ability to question why. Section 6. Maggie Simpson, the silence that was never accidental. Maggie Simpson does not speak. She has been not speaking for 36 years, across hundreds of episodes, through countless situations where a child with normal developmental progress would have long since developed a substantial vocabulary and a growing capacity for complex verbal communication. Maggie Simpson continues to communicate primarily through pacifier sounds, pointed stares, and occasional sounds of emphasis that carry specific meaning within the family, but do not constitute language in any conventional sense. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old since 1989, and in the 36 years she has occupied that age without advancing past it, she has accomplished more than every other member of her family combined. She shot a billionaire and was never prosecuted. She organized and led a successful rebellion against a tyrannical daycare administrator. She has saved members of her family from life-threatening situations through interventions that required planning, execution, and timing that no 1 year old should be capable of. She has demonstrated problem-solving abilities in contexts that would challenge adults several decades her senior. And in every instance, without exception, she has accomplished these things without making a sound that could be directly attributed to conscious verbal intention. The silence is the mystery. Not the intelligence, we will get to the intelligence, but the silence specifically. Because the silence, when you examine it carefully against the evidence the show has provided, does not look like developmental delay. It does not look like the absence of something. It looks like the presence of something, a choice, a strategy. The silence of someone who has looked at the available options and decided, with more clarity than anyone else in her family has managed, that not speaking is more useful than speaking. Let's start with the shooting. Because the aftermath of the Burns incident tells you more about Maggie than the incident itself does. In the final moments of Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 2, after the investigation has concluded and the official verdict has been delivered and everyone has accepted the finding and departed the scene, the camera finds Maggie alone in the room. The family is gone. The investigators are gone. Springfield's attention has already moved on to the next thing. Maggie is alone, and she does what a person does when they are certain they are not being observed. She drops the performance. She looks around the room deliberately, checking each corner, confirming that she is unobserved, and then she moves her pacifier in a motion that precisely mimics the act of pulling a trigger. The show presents this as confirmation. Maggie did it. She knows what she did. The case is closed. But watch the sequence again without the confirmation framing. What you see is a baby who looks around a room to make sure she is alone, and then privately, secretly, reenacts something she witnessed. The checking of the room is the critical detail. Reflexive behavior does not begin with a scan of the environment for observers. Instinctive physical repetition, the kind of mimicry that very young children engage in when they absorb something they have seen an adult do, does not start with a deliberate assessment of whether anyone is watching. That environmental check, that specific, conscious, deliberate confirmation of privacy before the gesture is made, is the behavior of someone who understands that the gesture has significance, that it carries risk, that it should not be performed in front of witnesses. Maggie is 1 year old. She checked the room for witnesses before reenacting the shooting. Either this is confirmation that she pulled the trigger and she is aware of the gravity of what she did, or it is confirmation of something even stranger, that Maggie witnessed the actual shooter and is replaying what she saw, and she checked for observers before doing so because she understood, at some level, that what she knows is information with consequences. Both readings require a degree of situational awareness, strategic thinking, and impulse management that developmental psychology does not associate with 1-year-olds. Either way, the girl checking the room before performing the trigger motion is not behaving like a baby. She is behaving like someone who understands what information she holds and has made a conscious decision about how to handle it. The Longest Daycare, the theatrical short released in 2012 and nominated for an Academy Award, is the show's most direct and extended examination of what Maggie is actually capable of when the constraints of a 22-minute episode with multiple competing storylines are removed. The premise is simple enough. Maggie is dropped at a daycare center run with the rigid efficiency of an institution designed to identify and suppress exceptional ability, and she encounters a caterpillar she wants to protect from a bullying peer who wants to destroy it. What follows is not a baby having a lucky adventure. It is a 7-minute case study in applied intelligence operating under severe physical constraints. Maggie reads the environment. She maps the facility, identifies its resources, catalogs its threats. She develops a plan, executes it under time pressure, adjusts when elements of the plan fail, identifies alternative approaches, coordinates her movements around the predictable behavior patterns of the adults and the competing child, and ultimately succeeds through a combination of foresight, adaptability, and the specific kind of problem-solving that requires holding multiple variables in mind simultaneously and updating their relationships in real time. She does all of this while her body continues to limit her in the ways that actual 1-year-old bodies limit people. She falls. She stumbles. She cannot run when running would help her. She has to work around the motor skill limitations of her physical development at every stage of the plan. And the plan works anyway because her cognitive capacity compensates for every physical limitation her body imposes. The brain is operating at a level that the body cannot fully support, and the brain wins anyway. This is not the behavior of a baby who happens to be lucky. This is the behavior of an intelligence that is being constrained by its physical container, working around that container's limitations with the resourcefulness of someone who has been doing this for a long time and has gotten very good at it. The intelligence test episodes, spread across the show's run and varying in their specific results depending on the needs of the individual story, establish a consistent pattern beneath their surface inconsistency. Whatever the specific score, whatever the specific context, Maggie's measured cognitive ability always registers as extraordinary relative to what her age and developmental stage should produce. The show plays this for quick jokes and moves on. But the pattern across multiple episodes, across different writing staffs, across different approaches to what the show wanted to do with Maggie in a given story, is not coincidental. It reflects something that the writers have collectively understood and repeatedly returned to. Maggie is not normal, and the not normalness operates in the direction of exceptional rather than limited. Now consider Lisa. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She is one of the most intelligent characters on the show by any consistent measure. She plays her saxophone with professional-level skill. She has a documented IQ that places her well above average for any age group. She reads widely, thinks critically, argues from evidence, and has spent her entire fictional existence trying to use these capabilities in service of making Springfield a better, more just, more thoughtful community. And what has it gotten her? Isolation, primarily. Lisa is the smartest person in most rooms she enters, and most rooms respond by making her understand that being the smartest person present is not an asset she is being invited to use. She is dismissed by her father, who loves her deeply but cannot track most of her conversations. She is admired but not fully understood by her mother, whose emotional intelligence is exceptional but whose intellectual range does not match Lisa's. She is tolerated by her brother, who has his own form of intelligence but applies it primarily to immediate tactical situations rather than the sustained analytical work that Lisa engages in. She is dismissed by her peers, who find her intensity alienating and her intelligence threatening. She has spent her entire fictional life fighting to be taken seriously in an environment that has never offered that reward consistently. Maggie has been watching this happen since she was born. She has watched the most intellectually capable person in the Simpson household spend every waking hour fighting for recognition that keeps not arriving, pushing against a community that pushes back harder, using her intelligence visibly and loudly, and being penalized for it with a consistency that would eventually teach most people to stop. Maggie learned something different. She learned that Lisa's approach, however admirable in its commitment, is expensive. It costs enormous energy and delivers limited return. It makes you visible in ways that attract resistance. It puts you in direct conflict with systems and people who have more institutional power than you do and are not interested in the challenge you represent. What if you just did not announce yourself? What if you solved the problems, protected what needed protecting, acted when action was required, and did all of it in the margins, in the background, in the spaces that nobody monitors because nobody has any reason to think those spaces are where anything important happens? What if you use the most effective disguise available, the assumption that a baby is not doing anything worth paying attention to as a permanent operational cover? Every time Maggie does something remarkable, the family does not notice. The community does not notice. She shot the richest man in Springfield, and the investigation focused on every adult present before arriving at her almost as an afterthought, and then concluded with relief rather than alarm, because a baby cannot be prosecuted. The daycare rebellion succeeded in part because nobody monitors infants closely enough to observe them organizing. Her interventions, each one significant, each one demanding a level of capability that should be impossible for her stated age, happen below everyone's radar because she has deliberately kept herself below everyone's radar. She is not invisible because nobody is paying attention. She is invisible because she has engineered her invisibility. The radiation theory offers a specific framework for understanding how Maggie's intelligence arrived at this level. If Springfield's contaminated environment produces mutations, and if those mutations express differently in different individuals depending on some combination of genetic predisposition and exposure patterns, then the Simpson children represent a set of different outcomes from the same environmental input. Homer's mutation primarily affected his cognitive function downward, suppressing intelligence to a level that made him useful to Burns and harmless to the broader order of things. The same environmental cause, operating on Maggie's particular biological substrate, may have produced the opposite result. Not suppression but amplification, not a diminishment of cognitive capacity, but an extraordinary and disproportionate increase in it. Homer and Maggie are the two ends of what Springfield does to human intelligence. He is what happens when the mutation takes something away. She is what happens when the mutation adds something extraordinary. And the family has never fully appreciated either result, because Homer's limitations are too familiar to seem remarkable, and Maggie's capabilities are too carefully hidden to be seen. The coma theory offers its own reading of Maggie's intelligence, and it is one of the most emotionally precise things that framework generates. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode is the product of an unconscious mind working through its love for the family it cannot reach, then Maggie's extraordinary capabilities are Homer's deepest hope made visible. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her learn to walk properly or speak her first full sentences, or develop from the baby he last held in 1993 into whoever she is becoming while he is unconscious. He cannot know what kind of person she will be. And so, in the dream, he makes her already extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that exceeds what any one-year-old should possess, because the dream is where his hopes for her live, uncontradicted by the reality he cannot access. Her genius is a father's prayer, expressed in the language of dream logic. But outside the coma, back in Springfield as it materially exists, the most unsettling thing about Maggie is not what she has done. It is the sense that the 36-year performance of silent, passive infancy is building towards something. That the watching and the waiting and the strategic invisibility are accumulating into a readiness that has not yet found its moment. That whatever Maggie has been planning, and the show provides sufficient evidence to sustain the argument that she has been planning something, has simply not yet arrived at the point of execution. She is 1 year old. She cannot walk without falling over. She cannot form a sentence. She is physically limited in ways that constrain almost everything she might want to do in the physical world. But her mind works fine. Her mind has been working fine for 36 years, observing everything, cataloging everything, building a model of Springfield and its systems and its power structures and its vulnerabilities that is more complete and more accurate than any model any other character on the show possesses. When Maggie finally acts on that model, when she decides the moment has arrived, and the situation calls for something more than strategic invisibility, Springfield will not see it coming. Nobody will, because that is exactly how she designed it. The most powerful person on Evergreen Terrace has been sitting in a high chair for 36 years, waiting for the right time. She is still waiting. Section 7. Mona Simpson, the conspiracy that broke 3 generations. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, had told him his mother passed away when he was young. There was a grave. Homer visited it. He processed his grief in the incomplete, surface-level way that Homer processes most things that require sustained emotional engagement, and he grew up carrying the specific weight of maternal loss without ever fully examining what that weight had done to the shape of his character. What that weight produced over decades was a particular emotional architecture that the show captures with more precision than it typically gets credit for. Homer's desperate need for affirmation from the people around him, his clingy relationship with Marge, the anxious quality underneath his love for her, the way he treats even small gestures of approval from her as disproportionately significant, his terror of abandonment, which manifests in his refusal to leave situations that are clearly bad for him, because the alternative, being without the familiar, is experienced as more threatening than the familiar's costs. His willingness to endure years of humiliation and indifference from Burns, to return every day to a job where his employer cannot remember his name, because having a job means having a structure that provides a kind of stability that Homer, deep in the parts of himself he has never fully examined, believes he does not deserve better than. This is the emotional blueprint of a man who was told, at a foundational age, that the person who was supposed to want him most had left, had died, which is the ultimate form of leaving, and who never received an alternate framework for understanding why, which means the only available interpretation was the one that children without better options always arrive at. She left because of something about me. In Season 7, everything changes. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired on the 19th of November, 1995. And it is by general consensus one of the greatest episodes the show has ever produced. Remarkable, not for its comedy but for the specific quality of its grief. The grief of adults who missed each other across decades, who found each other too late to recover what was lost, who love each other fully and can do nothing with that love except acknowledge it across the distance that someone else created between them. Here is what the episode reveals. Homer fakes his own death to avoid working on a Saturday. It is the kind of premise the show has always been comfortable with. A small, selfish decision that spirals into unforeseen consequences. The consequence in this case is that Homer, correcting the official record of his death at the Hall of Records, discovers something that the municipal records of Springfield have been sitting on for decades without anyone apparently noticing. According to the files, Homer's mother is not dead. She was never dead. The grave Abe showed him, the one Homer has been visiting and mourning at for years, belongs to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe has been sending his son to grieve at the headstone of a 19th-century American literary figure. Homer finds Mona at a cemetery. She does not recognize him at first. He has changed, grown into the person he became in her absence. When he proves who he is, the reunion the show produces is one of the most nakedly emotional things it has ever allowed itself. A grown man who has spent his life believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather die than raise, standing in front of the mother who did not die, the mother who chose to leave, the mother who had a reason. Mona tells him the truth. She did not die. She did not leave because she stopped loving him. She left because Burns forced her out, and because leaving was the only way to protect her family from what Burns would have done to them if she had stayed. The story goes back to 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife, unremarkable in the way that the lives of women without external outlets for their capability are often unremarkable from the outside, while being full of specific, active, intelligent experience on the inside. She was married to Abe. She had a young son. She was living in Springfield, while the world outside was in the process of tearing itself apart and reconstructing the terms of American life. The civil rights movement, the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam protests, the late 1960s were a moment of extraordinary social pressure, The kind of moment that radicalizes people who might otherwise have remained inside the comfortable container of their existing lives. Mona was radicalized. She joined a group of activists, and they targeted a facility owned by Mr. Burns. Not the nuclear power plant, something else. Something that the show drops into the story with what should be an earth-shaking casualness, but which most viewers absorb and move past because the episode keeps rolling and the comedy keeps generating forward momentum. Burns owned a biological weapons laboratory, a germ warfare facility in Springfield, operating in the same community where Homer was growing up, where children were attending school, where families were going about their ordinary lives with no knowledge that the richest man in town was manufacturing weaponized pathogens in a facility that was almost certainly operating outside regulatory oversight. Burns was cooking diseases in Springfield, and he had been doing it, presumably, for long enough to have developed the infrastructure that Mona's group targeted. The activists broke into the lab and destroyed the biological agent stored inside, using what the show calls an antibiotic bomb. The raid succeeded. The weapons were neutralized. And during the chaotic exit from the facility, Mona made the mistake that defined the rest of her life. Someone had fallen during the action, and she stopped to help them up. The person she helped was Burns. She stopped to assist her enemy, and Burns saw her face, and Burns never forgot. He reported her to the FBI. She became a fugitive. She could not go home. She could not contact Abe. She could not hold her son or explain to him why she was leaving, or tell him that leaving had nothing to do with anything about him. She kissed a sleeping Homer goodbye and disappeared, and Homer woke up in a world that did not contain his mother, and Abe told him she was dead, and Homer believed it. For 27 years. Now consider the conspiracy that this backstory reveals, because the full architecture of what Burns has done to the Simpson family across 3 generations does not become visible until you lay all the pieces out in sequence. Burns drove Mona away when Homer was young, which created the emotional conditions that produce the particular Homer that the show depicts. Damaged, approval-seeking, unable to assert himself, constitutionally unsuited for the kind of resistance or self-advocacy that would threaten Burns's control of his workforce and his community. The Homer that Mona's forced departure produced is exactly the Homer that Burns needed in Sector 7G, compliant. Grateful for whatever scraps of stability he can find. Unable to quit because quitting would mean confronting the void that the absence of his mother first opened in him. Then there is Abe Simpson's deal. The show reveals in a later episode that Burns committed some unspecified crime and Abe discovered it. Rather than report Burns or use the knowledge as leverage for Mona's return, Abe negotiated a personal arrangement. In exchange for his silence, Burns guaranteed Homer's continued employment at the plant regardless of his performance. Homer's improbable job security, his ability to survive 742 documented errors without being permanently terminated, is not a function of Burns's forgetfulness or negligence. It is a contractual obligation that Burns assumed specifically to secure Abe's silence about whatever crime Abe witnessed. Homer works at the power plant, in daily proximity to the man who destroyed his family, because his grandfather made a deal with that man to ensure he could. Homer does not know any of this. The show makes this explicit and plays the ignorance as tragedy rather than comedy. Homer learns in Mother Simpson that his mother was alive and that Burns drove her away. He makes the connection between Burns and his mother's forced exile. He sees the relationship between the man who signs his checks and the man who stole his childhood. And then, and this is the specific detail that the show understands, is devastating. Precisely because it is so consistent with Homer's character, he does not act on it. He does not confront Burns. He does not quit. He does not even appear to fully integrate the knowledge in a way that changes his behavior at work. He grieves quietly for what he now understands, and then he goes back to work. Because going back to work is what Homer does. Because the alternative is a confrontation with the full picture of what his life has been built on, and the full picture is unbearable, and Homer's capacity for bearing unbearable things has been systematically eroded by the very forces that created the unbearable picture in the first place. Burns took Homer's mother. The taking of his mother created the emotional damage that made Homer the employee Burns needed. The employment positioned Homer in daily proximity to the man who created the damage, where Burns could ensure the damage never healed sufficiently to produce a Homer capable of understanding and resisting what had been done to him. And then, as a structural guarantee, Burns made a deal with Homer's father to ensure Homer's employment continued, regardless of any factor Homer might control. 3 generations of the Simpson family, broken and arranged and secured inside a system that Burns designed for his own benefit. Abe, who knew enough to make the deal and chose silence over resistance. Mona, who fought and was destroyed for it. Homer, who inherited the consequences without ever being told what the architecture of his life was built on. Homer, without the crayon, is brilliant. He is articulate and aware, and capable of the sustained analytical thinking that reveals the structure of his circumstances clearly. But brilliant Homer chose to have the crayon replaced. He chose stupidity. He chose the fog. And the show asks you to feel something specific about that choice. Not contempt, not frustration, but the specific heartbreak of understanding that the choice was never really free. The system that Burns built around Homer was designed to make clarity unbearable, to ensure that the state of knowing your circumstances fully was more painful than the state of not knowing, to guarantee that a Homer with his full cognitive function intact would look around Springfield and see something so enormous and so inescapable that retreating into fog was not weakness but survival. Burns did not just take Homer's mother. He engineered the conditions that made Homer's grief for her unanswerable, his situation unreformable, his life a series of returns to the scene of a crime he was never given the tools to name. Mona Simpson fought back against Burns and lost everything. She spent 27 years in exile, unable to contact her family, unable to return to the son she had kissed goodbye in the dark. When she did come back, when she found Homer grown and changed and carrying the specific damage her absence created, Burns found her within days, and she had to run again. The show gives them some time together, enough for Homer to understand what he lost and why, before Mona disappears into the underground she has been living in since 1969. Her death, in a later season, is one of the show's most restrained and therefore most affecting moments. Homer beside her, holding her hand, the two of them together, finally, in the way that the intervening decades prevented, and the time they have being measured in the small hours of a final night, rather than the years that should have been available. The show does not make a joke here. It does not cut away. It holds on the two of them and lets the weight of 27 stolen years settle into the room. Burns won. He always wins. Because in Springfield, the man who controls the infrastructure controls the story, and the story of the Simpson family has been written by the man in the big house by the nuclear plant since before Homer was old enough to know there was a story being written. The most important character in Simpsons history barely appears in the show. Mona Simpson is in perhaps a handful of episodes. But every single thing that makes Homer Homer, every vulnerability, every need, every failure of nerve, every moment of unexpected grace was shaped by the night she kissed him goodbye and ran. Burns's grudge against a woman who destroyed his weapons lab traveled forward through time and infected 3 generations of a family that never fully understood what was happening to them. That is the conspiracy that sits underneath the comedy. That is what the show has been quietly accumulating for 36 years in the spaces between the jokes. Section 8. The Principal and the Pauper. When Springfield voted to erase the truth. Season 9, Episode 2. The 28th of September, 1997. The episode is called The Principal and the Pauper, and it is, depending on who you talk to, either the worst episode of The Simpsons ever produced or the most important one. The two assessments are not actually incompatible, and the more time you spend with the episode on its own terms, the more you begin to suspect that the reason it provoked such intense negative reaction from fans and critics alike was not that it failed to be good television. It was that it succeeded in being something the audience found deeply uncomfortable. Let's walk through what happens. Springfield Elementary holds a celebration honoring Principal Seymour Skinner for 20 years of service to the school. In the middle of the celebration, a stranger enters. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner, a name most of the room recognizes as belonging to the man standing at the front of the auditorium. But the stranger clarifies, he is the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war, presumed killed, and who survived his captivity, escaped, and eventually made his way back to Springfield to find that someone else had been living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is revealed to be Armin Tanzarian. Before Vietnam, Tanzarian was a petty criminal from nowhere, a kid with no family, no direction, and no particular reason to expect that his life would amount to anything. He was drafted. He served in the same unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and the military declared him dead, Tanzarian felt guilty enough to seek out Skinner's mother, Agnes, in Springfield, to deliver the news of her son's death in person. When he arrived, Agnes assumed he was Seymour. She needed him to be Seymour. And Tanzarian, who had never been needed by anyone, who had never had a home or a name worth keeping, made a choice. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the mother, the apartment, the professional identity, and the 20 years of community relationships that went with all of it. He built a life inside someone else's skeleton. And he did it well enough that nobody noticed for 2 decades. Then the real Skinner walked in, and everything collapsed. Springfield holds a town meeting. Both men are present. The truth is fully established and publicly acknowledged. Every person in the auditorium now knows that their principal is an imposter, that the man who has been running their school and living among them and participating in their community for 20 years is not who he has claimed to be. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual decorated veteran whose identity was appropriated, is standing in the room with documentation and witnesses and the undeniable physical evidence of his own existence. The town votes on what to do about it. They vote to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issues a legal decree establishing that Armin Tanzarian is henceforth, legally and permanently, to be considered the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war hero who survived a prisoner of war camp and came home to find his life occupied by a stranger, is tied to a railroad car and physically removed from Springfield. And the decree makes it explicitly illegal under penalty of torture. The word torture appears in the legal decree, read aloud by a judge in an official proceeding, to ever again mention the name Armin Tanzarian or acknowledge the truth that the town meeting established. The truth is criminalized. The messenger is exiled. The lie is given legal status. Fans hated this episode with a consistency and intensity that has not diminished across the decades since its original broadcast. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, publicly stated his displeasure with the storyline. Critics argued that the episode retroactively undermined everything the audience had invested in Skinner's character across 8 previous seasons. The military service that gave his relationship with authority its specific texture, the dynamic with Agnes, which acquired new and uncomfortable dimensions when you understood their actual relationship. The relationship with Bart, built over years of adversarial mutual respect, suddenly reframed as something built entirely on a fiction. Everything about Skinner was revealed to be constructed on a borrowed foundation, and the episode offered no real resolution to the vertigo that revelation created. It is consistently rated among the series' worst episodes. It is the go-to example in fan discussions of the moment the show lost its way. And in one sense, the criticism is fair. The episode creates a mess that cannot be cleanly resolved, and rather than engaging with that mess, it simply declares it solved by decree and moves on. But here is the thing the criticism consistently misses. The episode is not making a mistake. The episode is making a statement about Springfield that the show had been building toward, without making explicit for 8 seasons. It is a statement that is uncomfortable precisely because it is accurate, not just about the fictional town, but about the mechanisms of collective denial that any community employs to maintain its preferred version of reality against the pressure of inconvenient truth. What Springfield does in that town meeting is not unusual. It is, in fact, a compressed and heightened version of what communities do constantly when a truth emerges that threatens the structures they have built and the relationships they have invested in. They assess the cost of the truth not in abstract moral terms, but in practical terms, in terms of what it would require to restructure their reality around accurate information, and they compare it to the cost of the lie. And when the cost of the truth is sufficiently high and the lie is sufficiently established, they choose the lie. They choose it collectively, through consensus, and they maintain it through social pressure and, if necessary, through the formal mechanisms of institutional authority. Springfield votes to keep Tanzarian as Skinner not because they are uniquely corrupt or uniquely stupid, though the show has always been generous in attributing both qualities to them. They vote to keep Tanzarian because 20 years of investment in a relationship with a person does not dissolve when you learn that person had a different name in a different life. Because the school works. Because Agnes has a son, and even if that son's claim to the name is technical rather than biological, the relationship is real. Because the real Skinner is a stranger who has shown up to claim something that the town has already allocated to someone else, and accommodating that claim would require dismantling arrangements that function and replacing them with an unknown quantity. The practical arguments for keeping Tanzarian are real. The episode acknowledges this, if only by making the town's decision unanimous rather than contested. Springfield is not making an irrational choice. It is making a choice that real communities make constantly, the choice to prioritize continuity over accuracy, established relationships over truth claims, the functional present over a historically correct but practically destabilizing past. But the episode also shows you the mechanism of that choice in a way that Springfield's other resets do not. Every other time the show resets to baseline after a catastrophe, the reset happens off-screen. You simply notice in the following episode that the world has returned to normal and the catastrophe is not being discussed. The mechanism of the reset is invisible, which allows you to accept it without examining it. The principle and the pauper shows you the mechanism. It puts the vote on screen. It gives you the town meeting, the hands raised for and against, the judge's decree, the physical removal of the truth from the community's borders. It makes you watch the reset happen deliberately, consciously, as a collective act of choice, rather than as the natural settling that follows a disruption. And once you have seen it happen deliberately and consciously in one context, you cannot easily unsee it in every other context where the show's reset happens. Every time Springfield forgets a catastrophe, every time a disaster leaves no trace by the following episode, every time the slate is wiped clean and the show returns to baseline, the principle and the pauper is the template that explains how it happens. Not through magic, not through lazy writing, through community decision-making, through the same kind of social consensus that any community deploys when it decides that the truth is too expensive to sustain. Springfield resets because Springfield chooses to reset. Collectively, deliberately, through an unspoken social contract whose terms are clear to everyone who lives inside it, even if nobody ever articulates them explicitly. We will not acknowledge what happened. We will maintain the agreed-upon version of events. We will treat the comfortable fiction as the functional truth. And anyone who insists on the actual truth, anyone who shows up with evidence and demands that the community restructure itself around accurate information rather than useful fiction, will be removed from the community. The real Seymour Skinner is tied to a train and expelled because he is the truth, and the truth cannot be tolerated inside a community that has decided, rationally and in full awareness of what it is doing, that the lie is more useful. He is Springfield's canary in the coal mine, the signal that the air inside has become incompatible with honesty, and the community responds not with alarm but with procedure, not with shame but with legal authority, expelling the canary and sealing the mine. This dynamic operates across the full history of Springfield. Burns has been poisoning the town for decades, and nobody has organized against him, because organizing would require confronting the dependency the poisoning has helped create. Skinner was an imposter for 20 years, and the town voted to keep the imposter because the truth would require dismantling something that functions. Homer works for the man who destroyed his family because understanding that architecture fully would make his life unlivable in ways that not understanding protects him from. Springfield is not a community that cannot handle the truth. It is a community that has assessed the truth and determined that handling it is not worth what it would cost. That assessment, made by individual residents in different contexts for different reasons, has accumulated over time into a collective reality management system that is far more sophisticated and far more deliberately maintained than the episodic television explanation of continuity errors would suggest. And the principle and the pauper is the one episode that opens the hood on that system and lets you see the engine. No wonder fans hated it. No wonder it gets rated as the moment the show went wrong. It is far more comfortable to believe the show failed here, that the writers made a mistake, that they broke something that should not have been broken, than to believe the show succeeded in showing you something true about the community you have spent 9 seasons loving. Springfield is not an accident of bad writing. Springfield is a choice. 100 choices, made by thousands of people across decades, to live inside a version of reality that is more comfortable than the alternative. Every reset is a vote. Every forgotten catastrophe is a community decision. Every convenient amnesia is a collective exercise of the same authority that the town meeting exercised when it decided that Armin Tanzarian was Seymour Skinner and always had been. The real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere, tied to a railroad car, exiled from his own life, the last honest man in a town that made honesty a criminal offense. He is the price Springfield pays for the particular piece it has chosen. He is the cost of the lie, expelled beyond the town's borders so that the lie can operate without friction. And Springfield never thinks about him, because Springfield voted not to. Section 9. The predictions how a cartoon wrote the future. In the year 2000, an episode of The Simpsons depicted a possible future in which Lisa Simpson becomes President of the United States. In that same episode, Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office is identified as Donald Trump, who departed the office, leaving the nation in enormous fiscal distress. The episode aired 16 years before Trump's actual election in 2016. 16 years before the thing happened, a cartoon predicted it with enough specificity that the clip circulated widely through social media in the days after the election result was announced, and the phrase, "The Simpsons predicted it," entered public consciousness as something between a meme and a genuine cultural observation about the show's relationship to American reality. That is the headline example, the one everyone knows. The one that launched 1,000 videos and articles about the show's apparently prophetic capacities. But it is far from the only one, and the full catalog of apparent Simpsons predictions, when you lay them out together, produces something that demands more careful examination than either credulous amazement or dismissive debunking can fully account for. In 1995, a Simpsons episode depicted a device worn on the wrist that performed functions associated with what we would now recognize as a smartphone. The Apple Watch launched in 2015. In 1994, Homer travels to space alongside Buzz Aldrin in a story that predates the era of commercial space tourism by decades, but captures the specific experience of a private individual going to space with a combination of wonder and absurdity that the actual civilian space tourism industry has not fully managed to transcend. In 1998, Homer encounters a mathematical equation on a chalkboard that mathematicians have identified as an approximation of the mass of the Higgs boson particle, a discovery that would not be experimentally confirmed until 2012 at the Large Hadron Collider. In 1999, Homer theorizes about the shape of the universe in terms that align with cosmological research, suggesting the universe may be toroidal donut-shaped, in The Simpsons terms that emerged years after the episode aired. In 1993, an episode depicted a flu virus originating from Asia, spreading across an anxious Springfield population, triggering panic buying, and a desperate search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic, and during that fictional Springfield outbreak, the townspeople accidentally released a swarm of killer bees, which produced a specific kind of retrospective chill when Asian giant hornets, immediately dubbed murder hornets by an anxious media, appeared in North America during the actual 2020 pandemic. In 1996, a joke in a Homerpalooza episode depicted the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally booking the London Symphony Orchestra for a performance while under the influence of something that impaired their scheduling judgment. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed live with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall. The gap between the joke and the reality was 28 years. In 1998, the show depicted a media merger in which a massive corporation acquired a major film and television studio. Disney completed its acquisition of 20th Century Fox in 2019. The Simpsons, which airs on a Fox property, depicted its own eventual corporate absorption 21 years before it happened. The list continues. Video calling technology depicted years before FaceTime. Autocorrect failures depicted before autocorrect existed as a product feature. Surveillance culture depicted before the specific surveillance infrastructure that makes it pervasive was built. Smartwatches, curved television screens, mass fingerprint identification systems. The show's catalog of apparent forward vision is extensive enough that its cumulative weight produces a specific feeling, even in viewers who understand intellectually that each individual example has a rational explanation. The rational explanation is this. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes over 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of satirical observations, technological extrapolations, political projections, and cultural predictions. When you generate that volume of content over that length of time, some of it is going to align with subsequent events through the operation of pure statistical probability. A show that has made thousands of observations about the trajectory of American technology, politics, and culture will get some of those observations right, simply because the volume of attempts is large enough that chance alone guarantees some hits. The writers know this and have said it directly. If you throw enough darts, some of them will hit the target. The confirmation bias component is equally important. The Simpsons has also made thousands of predictions that did not come true. Jokes about jetpacks, about moon colonies, about technological developments that did not materialize, about political outcomes that went differently, about cultural shifts that never happened. Nobody screenshots those. Nobody circulates them on social media. Nobody builds conspiracy theories around the failed predictions, because confirmation bias works in only one direction. We remember the hits and forget the misses. The prediction phenomenon is in significant part an artifact of selective memory applied to a very large dataset. These explanations are correct. They are also insufficient, because they do not account for everything the data actually shows. The Trump prediction, for example, was not a vague extrapolation about celebrities running for office. It was specific. The episode named Trump by name. The show depicted him descending an escalator in a visual that mirrors almost exactly the famous escalator announcement he made in 2015, 15 years after the episode aired. Vague trend extrapolation does not produce that level of specific detail. Something more precise was happening in that writing room, even if the writers themselves did not fully understand what they were doing. The Siegfried and Roy episode did not simply joke about exotic animals being dangerous in a general way. It depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers, which is almost precisely what happened in 2003 when Roy Horn was critically injured by one of the act's tigers during a live performance. The specific details, the white tiger, the attack on a performer, the context of a live show exceed what statistical coincidence comfortably explains. The writers of The Simpsons, particularly during its golden age, were an unusually educated group by any standard. Multiple members of the core writing staff had degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite research universities. Several had significant backgrounds in mathematics, the physical sciences, and economics. They were not casual observers of American culture. They were trained analysts with disciplinary frameworks for understanding how systems develop over time, how trends propagate through institutions, how technological development follows predictable trajectories once the underlying capabilities are established. When they made a joke about a wrist-mounted communication device in 1995, they were not guessing blindly. They were applying the available evidence about the miniaturization of electronics to project forward to what was already technically possible, extrapolating from a trajectory that was already visible to anyone paying close enough attention. The Trump prediction works the same way. Trump had been publicly flirting with a presidential run since the late 1980s. His political ambitions were not secret. The writers observed this and combined it with their analysis of where American celebrity culture and political culture were converging, and they projected forward to the logical conclusion of that convergence. They were not prophets. They were attentive observers who pushed what they saw to its logical extreme and then wrote jokes about what they found there. But here is where the meta-theory comes in, the one that sits beneath the statistical and cognitive explanations and does something stranger and more interesting with the evidence. The Simpsons does not just predict the future. It shapes it. Not through any mystical mechanism, not through prophecy or conspiracy or the supernatural operation of some force that moves through television screens. Through the most mundane and powerful mechanism available to a piece of cultural media, the preparation of the audience's imagination for an outcome that has not yet arrived. The Simpsons has been the most pervasive piece of American cultural media across its run by several measures. It has produced more episodes than any other American animated series. It has been watched by more people across more decades than any comparable cultural artifact. Its jokes have entered the American vernacular in ways that have altered how a significant portion of the population talks about and thinks about the world. Its satirical observations have become reference points that people use to understand subsequent events. It is not just a show. It is a lens through which a substantial portion of American cultural life has been interpreted for 36 years. When The Simpsons made a joke about Trump becoming president in 2000, that joke entered the cultural bloodstream of millions of people. It became a reference point. It became something people mentioned when they saw Trump on the news, something they remembered when his name came up in political discussions, something that made the idea of a Trump presidency feel less like a shocking impossibility and more like an inevitable punchline already in the cultural pipeline. The joke did not predict Trump's election. The joke made Trump's election feel familiar before it happened. It lowered the psychological barrier between the audience's current reality and that specific future, making it easier to process when it arrived, because it had already been encountered in a different form. This is what cultural satire does at scale. It takes the future and makes it feel like the present has already begun moving toward it. It normalizes the outcome before the outcome arrives, so that when the outcome arrives, it feels less like a rupture and more like a confirmation of something already known. The Simpsons did not predict the Disney-Fox merger. It made media consolidation feel inevitable by depicting it as an obvious satirical observation about where corporate culture was already going. When the merger happened, people's response was not shock but recognition, the feeling of having already known this was coming, without being able to point to when they formed that knowledge. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has become Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and the audience looked into that mirror so consistently and for so long that the reflection and the original began to blur. The corrupt billionaire who owns the town's economy. The incompetent government official who mismanages the systems he is supposed to protect. The population too exhausted and distracted by immediate concerns to organize effectively against the forces that govern their lives. The endless cycle of catastrophe and catastrophe again, each disaster leaving less trace than the one before it. The collective amnesia that makes the same mistakes possible over and over because nothing accumulates toward a reckoning. Springfield is not a prediction of where America was headed. Springfield is a diagnosis of where America already was when the show began. The writers just wrote it down first, and over 36 years of continuous observation and extrapolation, they kept adding to the diagnosis in ways that tracked America's subsequent development with the accuracy of a very good model. And here is the detail that makes the prediction phenomenon genuinely strange, even for viewers who understand the statistical and cultural mechanics fully. The Simpsons writers have said, on multiple occasions, that some of the most specific apparent predictions left even them unsettled. Al Jean, the executive producer, has acknowledged that the Trump escalator visual in the 2000 episode is a specific detail that is harder to explain than the broad prediction of a Trump presidency. Bill Oakley has noted that, while most of the predictions are coincidence and trend extrapolation, some of them are specific enough to produce a genuine pause. The people who made the show, who understand its mechanics from the inside, who know exactly how the dart throwing works and what statistical probability accounts for, still occasionally look at a specific alignment between something they wrote in 1997 and something that happened in 2024, and feel something that is not quite explicable, not because they believe in prophecy, but because 800 episodes of concentrated attention on the nature of American life, applied by some of the sharpest analytical minds in television writing across 36 years, produces a document so detailed and so attentive that its relationship to subsequent events occasionally exceeds what comfortable probability can account for. Whether that excess is meaningful or coincidental remains genuinely uncertain. And that genuine uncertainty, the fact that even the people best positioned to dismiss the prediction phenomenon entirely sometimes cannot quite bring themselves to do so, may be the most interesting thing about it. Section 10. Where is Springfield, the town that exists everywhere and nowhere? Springfield is the most famous fictional town in American history. More people can name Springfield than can name the capital of half the actual American states. Its streets are mapped in the minds of millions of people who have never physically visited a place with that name. Its institutions, the nuclear power plant, the elementary school, the Quickie Mart, the church, the bar, the prison, the hospital, the town hall are as familiar as any real civic infrastructure. Springfield is a place in the way that places you have lived in are places, present in memory with the specific texture that only long familiarity produces. And nobody knows where it is. This is not an oversight. It is not a production decision made for convenience and maintained through inertia. The Simpsons has been actively and deliberately contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run, introducing geographic clues in one episode and contradicting them in the next, narrowing the field of possible states in one season and reopening it in another. The show has spent 36 years in active, sustained defiance of the basic spatial question that any realistic fiction would require to answer. Where is this place? The contradictions are not subtle. Springfield has, across different episodes, been depicted as bordering Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky. It has been placed on the Pacific coast and the Atlantic coast, and in the landlocked interior. It has been shown to have access to mountains, ocean beaches, deserts, forests, and farmland, sometimes within the distance that a short drive implies. It exists simultaneously in the north and south of the continental United States, depending on which episode is providing the geographic context. Its climate ranges from blizzard conditions to tropical heat within individual seasons, suggesting either extraordinary meteorological variation or the complete absence of any consistent relationship between Springfield's position and any actual climate zone. Lisa's telephone area code, visible in one episode, begins with 636, which is registered to Missouri. In another episode, the state abbreviation shown on an official document reads NT, which does not correspond to any existing American state. When Homer attempts to call the state capital and someone answers, they identify the state only as one beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some options while leaving dozens of others viable. The show gives you pieces that do not combine into a picture. Matt Groening, the show's creator, appeared to solve the mystery definitively in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine when he confirmed that Springfield was named after Springfield, Oregon, the town near Portland where he grew up. He chose the name specifically because Springfield is one of the most common city names in America. There are dozens of Springfields across the country, which would make it feel simultaneously specific and universal. For approximately 48 hours after this interview was published, the internet declared the mystery solved. Then the show continued being produced, and the subsequent episodes continued placing Springfield in geographic contexts inconsistent with Oregon, and it became clear that Groening's personal inspiration for the name had never been intended as a canonical geographic declaration. He named it after a place he knew. The show's writers continued placing it wherever the story needed it to be. The Oregon confession closed nothing. The most obvious explanation, and the one the show's creators endorse when pressed, is that Springfield's geographic universality is intentional design. A town that could be anywhere is a town that belongs to everyone. A Springfield that is definitively located in the Pacific Northwest is a show about Oregon. A Springfield that floats free of any specific geography is a show about America as a whole, the medium-sized American town that is recognizable to viewers regardless of their own location, the community that feels like somewhere you have been even if you have never been anywhere near it. The deliberate vagueness is in service of maximum resonance. Springfield is your town. Wherever you are from, the show wants you to see your own main street when it draws Springfields. This is a real explanation, honestly held by the people who make the show, and it accounts for the majority of the geographic contradictions. But it does not account for all of them, and the theories we have been exploring throughout this video provide alternative frameworks for thinking about why Springfield's location remains permanently, stubbornly, architecturally indeterminate. The radiation theory offers a strange and compelling reading. If the power plant has been altering the biological reality of Springfield's residents for decades, why should geography be exempt from the same distorting force? The radiation has produced biological outcomes that do not occur in normal human populations. It has altered the physics of individual bodies, their healing capacity, their appearance, their cognitive function. If the contamination is sufficiently pervasive and sufficiently powerful to fundamentally alter biological systems at a cellular level, is it categorically impossible that it has also altered the spatial organization of the environment itself? Springfield has both mountains and ocean beaches within what appears to be driving distance. No real American geography combines those features in that way. Maybe the impossibility is not a narrative choice but a physical symptom. The same force that gave Homer 4 fingers also compressed geographic features that should be hundreds of miles apart into a single, impossible, radiation-warped region. The coma theory's approach to the location question is more emotionally immediate. Homer went into his coma having spent his life in Springfield, which means Springfield is what his unconscious mind has access to as raw material. But Homer's interior map of Springfield is not a surveyor's map. It is an emotional map, assembled from decades of lived experience, colored by feeling rather than calibrated by measurement. The Springfield that his dreaming brain generates is not derived from a precise model of a geographically coherent place. It is derived from memories that have already been processed through the distorting lens of emotional significance, arranged according to narrative logic rather than spatial logic, assembled from fragments of everywhere Homer has ever been, and everywhere he has ever seen on television, and everywhere he has ever imagined without ever articulating the imagining. Dreams do not have geography in the conventional sense. They have topology, a sense of where things are in relation to each other emotionally and narratively, without the constraints of physical distance. Springfield's simultaneous access to mountains and oceans and deserts and forests is the dream logic of a man who has assembled his world from all the American landscapes he ever encountered, without the cartographic discipline to keep them in their correct relative positions. The collective denial theory produces a legal reading of the location question that is simultaneously the most cynical and the most practically grounded. You cannot regulate a power plant if you cannot establish jurisdiction over it. You cannot prosecute environmental violations if the state in which the violations occur cannot be definitively established. You cannot hold a community's billionaire employer accountable under any specific state's law if the community's location shifts depending on which episode you are watching. Springfield's geographic indeterminacy is not just a narrative convention. Under the framework that the principal and the pauper made explicit, it is a practical shield against accountability. A town with no fixed location has no fixed regulatory authority, no consistent EPA oversight, no permanent relationship with any specific state attorney general's office, no established jurisdictional clarity that would allow federal or state authorities to build a sustained case against the plant, its operator, or the systematic environmental damage it has been producing for decades. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Every time it seems to be settling somewhere specific, something shifts it back into ambiguity. The indeterminacy is maintained, actively and consistently, in the same way that every other inconvenient truth in Springfield is maintained, through the community's collective refusal to make official what it unofficially knows. Springfield is everywhere, because being everywhere makes it impossible to pin down, impossible to investigate, impossible to hold to the specific regulatory standard of any specific place. The town's refusal to have a fixed location is the ultimate application of Springfield's reality management philosophy. If you cannot find it definitively, you cannot definitely say what it has done. The episode Behind the Laughter, the 12th season's mockumentary about the Simpson family, included what appeared to be a definitive answer. The family is from northern Kentucky. This declaration appeared in the original broadcast. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The show gave you an answer and then changed the answer depending on which version of the episode you were watching. The truth shifted between broadcast. Even when Springfield has a definitive location, the definitiveness does not hold. This is not an accident of syndication. This is the show telling you, one more time, that Springfield's location is not a fact with a stable value. It is a variable that the show assigns contextually, depending on what the episode needs, and then reassigns when the episode changes. The town is wherever the story requires it to be. And the story requires it to be everywhere, because being everywhere is the only condition that allows Springfield to function as the universal American community it is designed to represent. Springfield will never be located. Every theory offers a framework for why, and every framework is internally consistent. It will remain the town that appears on no map, that exists in no specific state, that occupies no particular position in American geography. It will remain the place you know without knowing where it is, the community that feels like home to people who have never been there, the town that is every American town, because it has committed fully to being none of them. Section 11. Hans Moleman, Ned Flanders, and the characters the show quietly destroyed. Some of the most revealing things about Springfield are not in the main storylines. They are not in the A-plots or the B-plots or the season-long arcs that critics analyze and fans debate. They are in the background, in the margins, in the characters who appear briefly and regularly, carrying with them implications that the show drops into the narrative and then refuses to develop, leaving them to accumulate in the audience's peripheral vision, like objects half seen in a room you only ever pass through. Hans Moleman is the most killed character in American animation. This is a claim that can be made with reasonable confidence based on the evidence the show has produced across 36 seasons. Moleman, the tiny elderly, nearly blind man with the nasal voice and the permanent expression of mild bewilderment, who appears in Springfield's background with enough regularity to qualify as a supporting character, has been killed on screen more times than any reasonable accounting of a recurring character should permit. He has been struck by cars, crushed by heavy objects, buried alive in various contexts, incinerated, consumed by animals, struck by lightning with sufficient force to produce obvious fatalities. He has walked into traffic. He has fallen from heights. He has been the victim of the kind of catastrophic bad luck that, in any realistic context, would be considered not just tragedy but a public health concern requiring investigation. None of these deaths are in special episodes. None of them occur during the non-canonical Treehouse of Horror Halloween installments, where the show explicitly operates outside its normal rules. None of them happen in dream sequences or alternate reality stories. They happen in regular, canonical episodes in the Springfield that the show maintains as its persistent reality. Moleman dies, and then appears in the following episode completely unharmed, with no reference to what happened to him previously, ready to be killed again. Most fans accept this as a running gag. Moleman dies frequently. This is funny. The comedy comes from the consistency of his misfortune and the show's refusal to acknowledge or address the pattern. Do not think about it too hard. But Moleman has provided one piece of information about himself that makes thinking about it hard to avoid. He has stated his age as 31. He says this on camera, without evident irony, in a context that does not mark it as a joke. Look at Moleman. He appears to be 80 years old at minimum. His face is deeply lined. His posture is permanently stooped. He moves with the specific, careful deliberateness of someone whose body has been dealing with the consequences of age for a very long time. His vision is severely impaired. Everything about his physical presentation suggests a man who has been around for 8 decades or more. He claims to be 31. If he is telling the truth and the show provides no frame that explicitly marks the statement as false, then something aged Moleman catastrophically. Something took a person who should be in the middle of his life and transformed his body into the apparent condition of someone who has lived twice that long. Something that has also produced in him a specific relationship with death. He does not die the way characters in normal narratives die, in ways that have consequences and narrative weight and finality. He dies the way things die in Springfield, as a temporary condition that resolves between episodes through whatever mechanism Springfield uses to dissolve its own catastrophes. The radiation theory applies to Moleman with particular force. If the contaminated environment of Springfield produces mutations, and if different individuals express different mutations depending on their specific biology and exposure patterns, then Moleman might represent a case of extreme accelerated aging, the opposite of the frozen timeline that affects the main family, where Homer and Marge and the children are locked at their 1,989 ages. Moleman has been racing through time at an accelerated rate, aging at a pace that outstrips normal human development by a factor of 2 or 3. The same contamination that froze the Simpsons may have sent Moleman hurtling in the opposite direction, burning through decades and years. And the repeated deaths if Moleman's biology has been fundamentally altered at a cellular level, if the radiation has affected his tissue in ways that produce unusual regenerative capacity alongside the accelerated aging, then his pattern of death and return is not supernatural, it is biological. His cells die and reconstitute themselves with the same mechanism that allows Homer to survive injuries that should be fatal, simply more dramatically expressed. Moleman actually dies. His systems shut down, and then the same altered biology that caused his accelerated aging causes him to reconstitute, to come back, to show up in the next scene ready for another round. Springfield's strangest character may be its most informative one. He is the most extreme visible evidence of what the plant has done, expressed through the dual phenomena of premature aging and the capacity for biological reconstitution after fatal trauma. He is walking testimony to the specific kind of alteration that chronic nuclear exposure produces when it operates outside the normal bounds of human biology. He is, in the most direct possible sense, what Springfield does to people given sufficient time and insufficient protection. Nobody notices. Nobody investigates. A man who claims to be 31 but looks 80, who dies on camera with regularity and appears fully recovered in subsequent episodes, generates no official concern from anyone in a community that includes a functioning police department and 2 hospitals. Springfield has normalized Moleman's existence the same way it has normalized everything else about itself. He is just part of the scenery, like the cracked cooling towers, like the 3-eyed fish, like the fact that everyone's skin is yellow. Now consider Ned Flanders, who represents a different and in some ways more disturbing category of Springfield's background tragedies. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer is not. He is patient where Homer is impulsive. He is generous where Homer is acquisitive. He is devoutly religious where Homer is casual about faith at best. He is physically disciplined where Homer is the opposite. He is financially responsible, emotionally present with his children, a reliable neighbor, and a genuinely good-hearted member of his community. By any conventional moral accounting, Ned Flanders is a better person than Homer Simpson in every quantifiable dimension. The show punishes him for this relentlessly. His wife Maude was killed by a t-shirt cannon at the Springfield Speedway. This detail alone deserves a moment. Maude Flanders, a warm and devoted mother of 2 young boys, died because Homer was dodging the t-shirts being shot into the crowd and they hit Maude instead. Homer's selfishness, expressed in that specific moment, directly caused the death of his neighbor's wife. Ned lost his partner, his children lost their mother, and the mechanism of that loss was Homer Simpson's reflexive self-preservation. Ned forgave him. Of course he did. That is what Ned does. But the forgiveness lands differently once you understand what the show revealed in the hurricane episode, the one where a storm destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it so poorly that it immediately collapses again. Ned, who has been holding his patience and his forgiveness and his unfailing grace together through everything Springfield has thrown at him, finally breaks. He screams at the town. He says things about every person who has ever wronged him, things that have been accumulating for years, things he has never let himself express because expression felt like a violation of the values he holds. And then he is institutionalized. The institutionalization leads to a revelation: Ned's relentless niceness, his legendary patience, his ability to absorb punishment from Homer and Springfield and the world, and respond with grace every single time. These are not natural character traits. They are the product of intensive childhood behavioral conditioning. Ned was a violent, uncontrollable child. His parents, being committed to a philosophy of permissiveness that precluded discipline, took him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist spent years conditioning the aggression out of Ned's behavioral repertoire, programming responses of patience and forgiveness and grace so deeply into his psychological architecture that they effectively replaced the emotional responses that would have been natural without the intervention. Ned's kindness is a cage. It is a beautiful cage, lined with genuine feeling and real commitment to values that matter, but it is a cage nonetheless. He cannot express anger even when anger would be appropriate, even when anger would be the authentic response of any psychologically healthy person to the circumstances he has encountered. He cannot allow himself to feel the rage that lives underneath the conditioning because the conditioning trained him to treat any emergence of that feeling as a catastrophic failure requiring immediate suppression. His forgiveness of Homer, across decades of incidents, each of which should have tested a saint's patience, is not the grace it appears to be. It is the automated response of a man whose capacity for anger was surgically removed before he was old enough to choose. And the show knows what this means. It has shown you what happens when the conditioning fails, when the hurricane collapses the poorly built house, and Ned's psychological structure collapses with it. The person underneath is not violent. What emerges from Ned when the cage opens is not rage but despair. Bottomless, structural despair. The despair of a person who has done everything correctly by every available standard, who has maintained every value he was given and honored every commitment he made and forgiven every wrong that was done to him, and has received nothing in return from the universe that his faith tells him is just. Ned prays. He attends church without fail. He has organized his entire life around his faith in a God who, within the canonical reality of The Simpsons, demonstrably exists and has spoken with Homer directly. Twice, God has had actual conversations with Homer Simpson, a man who falls asleep in church and who has never in 36 years demonstrated the kind of sustained, committed spiritual engagement that Ned brings to every Sunday. And God has never spoken to Ned. Not once. Not a word. The most devout person in Springfield has received complete silence from a God who has been generous with theological chat toward a man who uses his faith primarily as a fallback when everything else has failed. This is not random. The show is making an explicit and uncomfortable argument about the relationship between moral behavior and cosmic reward. God talks to Homer because Homer needs it, because Homer is barely holding himself together and requires periodic divine intervention to maintain any connection to the values his better moments express. God does not talk to Ned because Ned's conditioning does not require divine reinforcement. Ned will maintain his values regardless of whether they are rewarded. The cage is self-sustaining. The programming operates independently of external validation. And this means Ned Flanders is the most forsaken character on the show. Not abandoned, he is surrounded by community and family. Forsaken in the specific sense that his fidelity to his values has been met with silence, his losses have not been compensated, his patience has not been rewarded, and the universe he believes in has provided him no direct evidence that his belief is noticed. Homer gets divine conversation and survives everything, and works in a job where his employer's negligence is structurally guaranteed. Ned loses his wife to Homer's selfishness, has his house destroyed by a storm, rebuilds his psychological structure every time Springfield breaks it, and receives no acknowledgement from the God he has spent his entire life talking to. They live next to each other. They have lived next to each other for 36 years. The gap between the man who tries and the man who does not has never closed. Because the system, the whole architecture of Springfield, the power plant and the radiation, and the collective denial and the floating timeline, and Burns's engineered control is not designed to close that gap. It is designed to keep Homer at his console and Ned at his window and Molman in the road and everyone exactly where the system needs them, forever. Section 12. The Loop. Why we cannot let them go and what that says about us. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. We have stood in the shadow of the cracked cooling towers and watched the steam rise and thought about what the steam contains. We have sat at Homer's hospital bedside in April of 1993 and wondered whether the machines keeping him connected to the world of the living are also the machines generating everything that has happened in the 36 years since. We have reopened the Burns shooting file and found it does not close as cleanly as the official verdict suggested. We have traced Burns's impossible longevity to its practical roots in engineered survival and the specific kind of wealth that does not allow itself to die. We have sat with Maggie in the room after everyone left and watched her check to make sure she was alone before she made the gesture. We have followed Mona through 27 years of exile and understood what one man's grudge does when it has sufficient resources and sufficient time. We have watched the town vote to criminalize the truth and expel the messenger. We have counted the predictions that came true and acknowledged the thousands that did not. We have searched for Springfield on every available map and found it on all of them and on none of them. We have watched Ned absorb the consequences of doing everything right in a system that does not reward rightness, and Hans Molman absorb the consequences of existing in a body that Springfield's environment has made into something that does not die the way things are supposed to die. Every theory in this video is different. Every theory uses different evidence, different logic, different starting assumptions about what The Simpsons is and what it has been saying across its run. The radiation theory grounds everything in the physical reality of contamination and its biological effects. The coma theory grounds everything in the psychological reality of an unconscious man's desperate dream of his family. The collective denial theory grounds everything in the social reality of communities that choose functional fiction over painful fact. The Burns immortality theory grounds everything in the economic reality of wealth that has become too powerful to be constrained by biological limits. The prediction theory grounds everything in the cultural reality of a show so embedded in American life that its relationship to that life has become genuinely difficult to characterize precisely. They use different frameworks and they arrive at different conclusions about specific questions. But every single one of them converges on the same fundamental observation. Something is wrong in Springfield. Not in the casual comedic sense that the show has always acknowledged Burns is evil, Wiggum is incompetent, Homer is obtuse. These are features of the setting rather than flaws in it. Wrong in a deeper, structural sense. Wrong in the way that a community is wrong when something about its foundational conditions has been compromised, when the rules that should govern the everyday experience of living in it have been altered by forces that operate beneath the surface of ordinary attention. The floating timeline is not a production device. It is a symptom. The residents who cannot age, the catastrophes that leave no trace, the memories that reset between episodes, the same mistakes made again and again without accumulation toward a reckoning. All of it is the surface expression of something that has been operating in Springfield since before the show began. Something that found its most visible form in those two cooling towers steaming on the horizon in the opening credits, but which predates even the plant itself, which is woven into the specific relationship between this town and the forces that have shaped it. And we, the audience, are not outside this system. We are inside it. Think about what it means to have watched The Simpsons for 36 years. To have absorbed the rhythms of Springfield's weekly reset. To have internalized the emotional logic of a town that recovers from everything and forgets everything and returns to baseline after every disruption. To have spent more time in Springfield, cumulatively, than in any number of real places you have visited. To have a relationship with the Simpson family that is, in the most literal, measurable sense, more continuous and more consistent than your relationship with most of the actual human beings in your life. We have been in Springfield since 1989, and we have never left. We visit every week. We know the address and the neighbors and the sound of the couch when Homer sits down on it too fast. We know what the air smells like around Moe's Tavern and what the light looks like on the Springfield Gorge at sunset. We know the school and the plant and the Quickie Mart and the church and the cemetery where Abe showed Homer a headstone that belonged to Walt Whitman. We have the geography of Springfield more completely mapped in our minds than the geography of many real cities we have spent time in. And Springfield has never aged in all that time. Bart has been 10 for as long as we have been watching. Lisa has been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer has been whatever age makes sense for a man in his mid-30s who was somehow also in high school in whatever decade the most recent flashback episode required. The family we have known for 36 years is exactly the family we met when the show began. The house looks the same. The couch gag plays. The opening credits run. Why can we not let them go? The obvious answer is that they are funny, and the show at its best has always been exceptionally funny, sharp and warm and generous in its comedy in ways that the competition has never quite matched. That is true. But it does not account for the specific quality of the attachment, the specific feeling of The Simpsons that differs from the feeling of other shows you find funny. There is something else there, something beyond the quality of the jokes. The Simpsons is the American family, not a representation of the American family in the sociological sense, not a study of one specific demographic configuration of American domestic life. The American family in the mythological sense, in the sense that the Norman Rockwell painting is the American family not literally accurate, not even aspiring to literal accuracy, but true in some other register, the register of collective imagination, of shared cultural projection, of the image of domestic life that a community builds and maintains, because it represents something the community needs to believe about itself. Homer is the father. Not a father, the father. The man who is simultaneously frustrating and loving, who fails more often than he succeeds but whose failures are failures of execution rather than intention, who loves his family with a completeness that his cognitive limitations prevent him from expressing gracefully, but that is never in question. Marge is the mother, the person who makes everything work through the application of patience and competence and love in quantities that no one around her fully recognizes as the extraordinary sustained effort they represent. Bart is the child we wanted to be, the one who resisted the system with a creativity and commitment we admired from the inside of our more obedient selves. Lisa is the child we should have been, the one who kept asking the inconvenient questions and kept paying the price for it. These are not just characters, they are projections. They are the shapes we have assembled from the materials of American family mythology and placed on a screen for 36 years, and we have loved them for so long and so consistently that the distinction between watching them and knowing them has effectively dissolved. And they have stayed exactly as we need them. Bart has not gone to college, Lisa has not moved away. Homer has not retired. Marge has not had the kind of personal reckoning that women who spend their lives holding everyone else together eventually have in reality. The furs are classes, the house is the same, the couch is there every Sunday. We built this preservation, not consciously, not through any explicit decision, but through the accumulated weight of 36 years of continued watching, continued engagement, continued investment in the version of The Simpsons that we first met in 1989. We kept the show alive through the periods when it was not at its best. We kept watching through the seasons that do not get defended in fan discussions, through the episodes that do not appear on anyone's best-of lists, through the years when the show was clearly running on something other than the creative energy of its golden age. We watched because the alternative, not watching, felt like something we were not ready for. Every rating that came in, every year the show continued to attract sufficient audience to justify another order of episodes, was a vote. It was the audience telling Fox and the producers and the writers and the animators that the show should continue. That the Simpsons should keep existing in the same form, in the same time slot, with the same family, in the same house, on the same street, in the same town that does not appear on any map. We voted to maintain the loop. We voted to sustain the fiction. We voted, continuously, for 36 years, in the same way that Springfield voted to keep Armin Tanzarian as Seymour Skinner. Because the alternative, letting the loop end, letting time start passing in Springfield, letting Bart turn 11 and Lisa turn 9, and Maggie finally speak her second word, means admitting something that the loop has been protecting us from admitting. 36 years have passed. We are older now. The world we were watching the show in when we first encountered it is gone, or transformed beyond easy recognition, or present only in the form of memory and the specific quality of feeling that memories of a younger self produce. The couch we sat on as children watching the opening credits may be gone, or in someone else's house, or in a landfill somewhere. The people we watched it with may have changed, or moved, or left in the more permanent way that people sometimes leave. All of that is true, and all of that is real, and none of it is visible inside Springfield, where nothing has changed, where the couch is exactly where it was, where the opening credits play every week, and Homer drives through the nuclear plant, and Marge does her grocery shopping, and Bart rides his skateboard, and Lisa plays her saxophone, and Maggie watches everything from behind the windshield of the family car as it pulls into the garage. As long as the show is on, as long as the loop keeps floating, as long as Bart is 10 and Lisa is 8 and Homer makes it home from the plant by 5:30, we do not have to acknowledge that 36 years have passed. We can sit down on whatever couch we currently own, in whatever house we currently inhabit, at whatever age we have reached in the real world, and we can go home. Not to our actual home, which is subject to the passage of time and the accumulation of consequence and the specific weight of 36 years of being in it. To the other home, the one on Evergreen Terrace, where the family is always intact and the kids are always young, and nothing that happens leaves a mark that lasts past the credits. This is why we cannot let them go. The loop is not their prison. It is ours. We built it, and we have maintained it, and we are as responsible for its continued operation as any radiation, any coma, any collective denial, any engineered immortality. We are the mechanism that keeps the clock stopped in Springfield, because stopping the clock in Springfield was the price of being able to visit whenever we needed to, and we have needed to, consistently, for 36 years. Every theory in this video is a way of looking at what is wrong with Springfield, but the deepest reading of every theory points back at the viewer. The radiation that altered Springfield's residents is something that came from outside them, something they were exposed to without choosing it, something that changed them before they had the awareness to resist. The coma that generated Homer's dream was something that happened to him, a consequence of accidents he did not choose, a condition he did not engineer. The collective denial that Springfield employs is a choice, but it is a choice made under duress, under the pressure of circumstances that make honesty genuinely costly. Our participation in the loop is the least defensible version of all of these. We chose it. We continue to choose it. Not under the pressure of radiation or trauma or economic dependency, but out of love, the specific, uncomplicated, slightly embarrassing love that we feel for a family we have known longer than we have known most of the actual people in our lives, and whose continued existence in the form we first encountered them feels important in a way that we have never needed to fully articulate, because the show has kept providing the thing we need without asking us to explain why we need it. Springfield is a mystery. It is dozens of mysteries layered on top of each other, each one hiding the next, each one offering a partial account of the strangeness underneath the comedy, each one pointing towards something fundamental about the specific community the show has created, and what it costs to live inside it, and what it costs to keep watching from the outside. But the deepest mystery is not in Springfield. The deepest mystery is the relationship between Springfield and us, the audience that made it possible, that sustained it, that voted for its continuation across 36 years, and will probably vote for it again. The mystery is what it means to love something this completely for this long, to need its preservation this urgently, to feel what we feel when we consider the possibility of its ending. Maybe it is simpler than any theory. Maybe we love them because they are us, the imperfect, resilient, often wrong and occasionally right collection of people that any family is when you look at it honestly. Homer with his enormous, clumsy love. Marge with her infinite patience hiding the specific exhaustion of someone who has been the last line of defense for too long. Bart with his creativity and his courage and his inability to apply either consistently toward anything productive, Lisa with her refusal to stop caring in a town that does not reward caring, Maggie watching everything from behind the pacifier, waiting for the moment she decides to act. They are us. They are the version of us that we recognize, that contains the qualities we know in ourselves but see more clearly from the outside, that reminds us what we looked like before the years accumulated into whatever we have become. And they will always be there, on Evergreen Terrace, in the house that does not change, in the town that exists everywhere and nowhere, in the loop that we built and that we maintain and that we will keep maintaining for as long as they give us the show and we choose to watch it. The clocks stopped in Springfield in 1989. We stopped them, and we have never, not once across 36 years, been ready to start them again. Thank you for spending 4 hours in Springfield with me. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Leave a comment below with where you are watching from and what time it is there. I want to know where this is landing around the world. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. Epilogue. The things that still do not have answers. Every story needs an ending. The Simpsons has resisted every attempt to give it one for 36 years. The show has not ended. The family has not aged. The loop has not been broken. And the mysteries we have spent 4 hours excavating have not been solved. Not by the theories we explored, and not by anything the show has officially provided. But before we close, there are things that deserve mention that have not yet been said, the loose threads that every comprehensive excavation of Springfield leaves behind, the questions that even the most thorough frameworks cannot fully address. Why does Homer, in his most genuine moments, display an emotional intelligence that far exceeds his documented cognitive function? The Homer who sat with his mother as she died, who understood without being told what the moment required, and who provided it that Homer is not a man with an IQ of 55. There is someone else living inside Homer's fog. Someone the radiation suppressed and the crayon contained and the accumulated weight of Springfield slowly smothered. Someone who emerges occasionally in moments of genuine emotional clarity and then retreats again. The radiation theory accounts for the suppression. The coma theory accounts for the dream's ability to generate a Homer more complex than Homer should be. Neither fully explains the specific quality of those moments of breakthrough, the sense that you are briefly seeing the person Homer would have been if the system had not required him to be this version instead. Why does Lisa keep fighting? This is a question that the show has never fully addressed and that the theories do not satisfactorily explain. Lisa has every reason to have given up years ago. She is the most intelligent person in Springfield in many respects, and intelligence in Springfield has never been rewarded with anything except isolation and frustration. She has watched her insights dismissed, her arguments ignored, her causes defeated by the combined inertia of a community that does not want to be improved. She has watched what happened to every other person who tried to tell Springfield the truth, including her grandmother. She should be exhausted. She should have arrived at the same strategic conclusion Maggie did and retreated into strategic silence. She has not. She keeps arguing. She keeps writing. She keeps playing her saxophone and raising her hand in class and telling the town what the evidence shows. At 8 years old, she has sustained a commitment to honest engagement with the world that most adults abandon long before they reach her actual or chronological age. The theories account for Springfield's capacity to suppress and contain. They do not fully account for Lisa's capacity to resist that suppression and keep going anyway. Maybe the most honest answer is that Lisa is what the show believes about the value of trying. Not the value of succeeding. Springfield is not a place that rewards success in that sense. The value of not stopping. Of continuing to ask the questions even when the answers are uncomfortable, even when the community does not want them asked, even when the asking costs more than any reasonable accounting would justify. Lisa is the show's argument against resignation, made in the character of an 8-year-old who has been arguing for 36 years and has not stopped. The question of what Maggie is waiting for remains genuinely open. We have explored her intelligence and her strategic silence, and the specific logic of her invisibility. But the endgame remains unspecified. What does the most capable person on Evergreen Terrace ultimately want? What condition would trigger the end of the waiting, the decision that the moment had arrived? The show has not said. It may never say. And that specific not saying may be the most honest thing the show has ever done about its quietest character. Acknowledging that she has plans the audience is not yet clear to know about, maintaining her operational security against even the examination of the viewer. The human skeletons in the basement of the nuclear power plant have never been identified or explained. 342 safety violations, and buried somewhere in that list is the implicit acknowledgement that there are human remains in the facility that their owners did not deposit voluntarily. The show dropped this information and moved on. Springfield moved on. Nobody has asked. In a different show, in a different kind of story, this would be a central plot point. In Springfield, it is scenery. The real Seymour Skinner is still out there. Wherever the train took him, he arrived there still carrying the truth that Springfield found too expensive to accommodate. He did not choose to be captured in Vietnam. He did not choose to come home to a life that had been occupied in his absence. He did not choose to disrupt Springfield's comfortable arrangement with the truth of his own existence. He is the most thoroughly wronged character in Simpsons history, more wronged than Homer, who at least does not know the full picture, more wronged than Ned, who has at least the comfort of his faith, more wronged than Mona, who at least had the dignity of choosing her exile. The real Skinner was exiled for being real, and Springfield sleeps soundly, having made it illegal to remember why. These loose threads will not be resolved. The show will not tie them off. The mysteries will remain mysteries, and the questions will remain questions, and the theories will remain theories, elaborate, well-supported, internally consistent, and officially unconfirmed. That is the deal Springfield offers. Come in, look around, find everything strange and familiar and wonderful and troubling in equal measure, and then accept that the answers are not available. The town does not give them up. The town votes to keep them buried. But the questions are still there. They have always been there. The show put them there, one episode at a time, over 36 years, building a picture with enough specific detail that the outline has become unmistakable, even if the lines have never been drawn explicitly. Something happened in Springfield. Something is still happening, and the people who live there cannot see it, because the thing that is happening to them also governs their capacity to see. We can see it. We have been watching from the outside, which gives us the distance their inside position denies them. And the view from out here, across 36 seasons of accumulated evidence, is this. Springfield is a town that was broken by something larger than itself, maintained in its broken state by forces that benefit from the brokenness, and preserved in amber by an audience that loves it too much to let it heal. That is the mystery. That is all of the mysteries. And Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. End of script. Total approximate word count, 52,000 plus words. Section 13. The secondary characters and what they reveal. Springfield's supporting cast as a complete map of American dysfunction. The main family gets all the attention. They always have. Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are the load-bearing walls of the Springfield structure, the characters around whom everything else is organized, the people whose stories the theories primarily address. But Springfield is not just 5 people on a couch. It is a community, a dense, layered, populated community with dozens of recurring characters who each carry their own specific burden, their own relationship to the contamination and the denial and the loop that keeps the town frozen in its particular version of the present. And when you start looking at the supporting cast the way we have been looking at the main family, not as comic relief or episodic color, but as evidence, as data points in the larger pattern, what you find is a complete map of American dysfunction, a comprehensive survey of the different ways that a community can be broken by the same underlying force while appearing to function normally on the surface. Start with Chief Wiggum. Ralph's father is one of the show's most consistent sources of comedy and also one of its most damning portraits of institutional failure. Wiggum is not just incompetent. He is incompetent in a specific, documented, institutional way. The kind of incompetence that only survives inside systems that are not designed to detect or correct it. He misidentifies suspects with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong because nobody has ever challenged him successfully enough to register. He misapplies laws. He pursues the wrong people for the wrong reasons using the wrong methods while the actual crimes go unsolved around him. He has solved precisely 0 significant cases in the entire history of the Springfield Police Department as depicted by the show, and he has remained employed and in charge for 36 years. This is not cartoon buffoonery. This is a specific portrait of how law enforcement fails in communities where oversight does not function. Wiggum's continued employment is not funny. It is a direct consequence of the same systemic failure that allows Burns to operate a plant with 342 violations without facing prosecution, that allows Armin Tanzarian to live under a stolen identity for 20 years without detection, that allows a billionaire to drive a woman into exile and then pursue her across decades without any legal accountability. The police in Springfield are not absent because the show did not bother to think through the legal infrastructure of its fictional town. They are present and useless, which is a specific and pointed observation about the relationship between legal institutions and the communities they theoretically serve when those communities are organized around the economic and social preferences of a single, powerful individual. Burns cannot be investigated effectively. The plant cannot be shut down. The truth about what has happened to Springfield cannot be officially acknowledged. Wiggum is not the cause of these failures. He is the product of them. His incompetence has been tolerated because his competence would be inconvenient not for Springfield generally but for the specific interests that shape what accountability is available in the town. A genuinely effective police chief would be a problem for Burns. Wiggum is not a problem for anyone except the people who need police protection and don't receive it. His son Ralph provides one of the show's most uncomfortable background observations. Ralph Wiggum is the sweetest child in Springfield by most measures. He is also profoundly disconnected from consensual reality in ways that the show plays as charming non-sequiturs but which, examined honestly, represent significant developmental concerns that his father has never addressed and the school has never addressed and Springfield has never addressed because Ralph's particular way of experiencing the world does not produce behavior that is disruptive to the people who might otherwise be motivated to help him. He is pleasant and docile and does not cause trouble. So he receives no intervention. So he continues being Ralph, suspended in his own particular version of the loop, a gentle and slightly alien presence in a town that has its own version of gentleness and its own version of alienation and does not know how to engage with the combination he represents. Apu Nahasapi Mapedalon ran the Quickie Mart for decades, and the show built his character around the specific experience of an immigrant in a community that is simultaneously dependent on his labor and unwilling to fully accommodate his existence on his own terms. His storylines trace the experience of assimilation under pressure, the performance of Americanness that the community expects alongside the persistence of the culture that makes him who he is, the negotiation between what Springfield wants from him and what he actually is. He has 8 children, a marriage that the show treated as both farce and genuine love story, a professional relationship with the Quick E-Mart corporate structure that trapped him in conditions he could not easily exit. He is Springfield's most complete portrait of the specific kind of economic captivity that the show, at its most attentive, understood was not incidental to the American experience but structural within it. Sideshow Bob Dr. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. deserves more than a paragraph, but also deserves specific mention in the context of what his recurring presence reveals. Bob is the most intelligent person in Springfield by most measures, more intelligent even than Burns, who is strategically intelligent but lacks the broad cultural and intellectual range that Bob possesses. Bob is educated, culturally sophisticated, capable of the kind of sustained analytical reasoning that would, in a different town in different circumstances, make him one of the most productive and influential people in the community. And his intelligence has been entirely consumed by an obsession with killing Bart Simpson, which has defined his existence across 36 years of increasingly elaborate failed attempts. The radiation theory does not have a specific account of Bob. The coma theory suggests he might be a subconscious manifestation of something Homer is afraid of, the intelligent, cultured, sophisticated alternative to Homer's own presentation, returning again and again because the dream cannot resolve the threat he represents. But the most interesting reading of Bob may be the simplest one. He is what happens when genuine intelligence and genuine capability are given no productive outlet in Springfield. He cannot run for office effectively, his history with Krusty and his conviction record prevent it. He cannot practice his profession. The town does not need what he offers. He cannot find a place in the community that matches his capabilities to a function. So his intelligence goes rogue. It turns inward and backward, toward the one fixed point of a grudge that has organized his entire post-prison existence. Bob is what Springfield does to talent when it cannot use it. Principal Skinner, or Armin Tanzarian, as we now know, is a case study in identity built from borrowed materials. Whatever the show intends us to take from the principal and the pauper revelation, the character who emerged from that backstory is genuinely interesting. A man who became the person he was pretending to be so completely that the distinction between the performance and the performer ceased to be meaningful in any practical sense. Skinner Tanzarian is the most dedicated educator in Springfield, regardless of what his original name was. His commitment to the school, his complicated relationship with its students, his specific and well-developed dynamic with Bart, none of these things depend on whether his name is Seymour or Armin. The character is real, even if the identity is constructed. And the show's decision to have Springfield vote to keep him rather than replace him with the real Skinner is, in this light, not entirely cynical. The community kept the thing that worked rather than the thing that was formally correct, and while the process of keeping it was deeply wrong, the underlying intuition that this particular person had earned his place regardless of how he arrived at it is not obviously stupid. Dr. Nick, whose greeting, "Hi everybody," is one of the show's most quoted running gags, is a portrait of medical infrastructure failure that becomes significantly less funny when you place it in the context of the radiation theory. Springfield's population is chronically ill in ways that the radiation theory explains as direct consequences of the plant's contamination. These people need functional medical care. They need competent physicians who can recognize and treat conditions that have been produced by decades of environmental exposure. What they have is Dr. Nick, who cannot reliably perform procedures that require basic anatomical knowledge. The joke is that Springfield's medical system is as incompetent as all of its other systems. The implication, once you take the radiation context seriously, is that the incompetence of Springfield's healthcare infrastructure is not incidental. It is a feature. Incompetent doctors do not identify radiation-related conditions. They do not file reports that create paper trails linking health outcomes to the plant. They do not produce the kind of documented evidence that would support regulatory action or legal accountability. Springfield's healthcare failure is Burns's healthcare insurance. Groundskeeper Willie occupies a specific position in the Springfield mythology as the town's most openly angry person, the character who expresses the frustration and rage that every other character in the community has been conditioned to suppress or redirect. Willie does not suppress. Willie roars. He confronts physical challenges with the unmediated ferocity of someone who was never given the behavioral conditioning that Springfield's more socially integrated residents received. He is, in many ways, what Ned Flanders would be if the therapy had not worked the id of Springfield, the version of communal feeling that the community's social norms are specifically designed to prevent from expressing itself. His outsider status, Scottish, hired for manual labor, living in a shack adjacent to the school marks him as someone who has access to Springfield structures without being fully inside them. He experiences the town from a slightly different angle, which gives him a clarity that insiders lack. His anger is frequently aimed in accurate directions. He is often the first character to name what is actually wrong with a situation, and the first to be dismissed when he does. Like Lisa, his clarity is a social liability. Unlike Lisa, he has never had the patience that Lisa's age and particular temperament give her. He cannot sustain the dignified battle. He just yells. And Springfield ignores his yelling, because the community has extensive practice ignoring the people who are loudest about what the community would prefer not to acknowledge. Kent Brockman, the local news anchor, is the show's portrait of media failure in a community where the media's primary function has been captured by the interests of the community's most powerful figure. Brockman is not an incompetent journalist in the way that Wiggum is an incompetent police chief. He has the skills. He has the instincts. He understands story. He is capable of producing genuine journalism when the story is something the town's power structure does not mind being told. When the story is something that the power structure minds when it touches on the plant, when it involves Burns's accountability, when it requires any form of investigative follow-through that might create friction with the most powerful economic entity in Springfield, Brockman's journalism mysteriously fails to arrive at the conclusions that the evidence would support. He is not corrupt in any simple sense. He is accommodating in the way that media in one-company towns is always accommodating, constrained by the awareness that the company owns the air the town breathes, and that the media organization's continued existence depends on maintaining a relationship with that company that does not become adversarial beyond a certain point. Brockman has found that point, and he has settled just below it, producing the appearance of journalism without the substance of accountability. giving Springfield the feeling of an informed community while ensuring that the information available never reaches the conclusions that genuine information about genuine conditions would produce. This is not fiction. This is a very accurate portrait of how local media functions in company towns, in communities where a single economic entity has sufficient power to shape the information environment without ever having to formally censor anything. You don't have to suppress the story if you've created conditions in which the story is never fully investigated. Milhouse Van Houten is Bart's best friend, and the show's most complete portrait of a child who has been shaped by his parents' failure into someone who cannot locate himself in the world. His parents' marriage fell apart in ways that the show traced with specific attention across multiple seasons, and Milhouse has absorbed the consequences without the vocabulary to describe what happened to him. He loves Bart with the specific intensity of someone who has decided that one relationship is going to have to carry all the weight that multiple relationships should distribute, which makes the friendship both more important and more fragile than it would otherwise be. He loves Lisa with a constancy that the show has played as a running joke, but which, examined honestly, is the behavior of someone who has found something reliable in a world where reliability has been in short supply. Milhouse is Springfield's child of divorce. Its avatar of the specific developmental experience of being raised in the aftermath of adult failure, and the show has always known that his particular combination of anxiety and loyalty and desperate hopefulness is both funny and genuinely sad. He is not the radiation theory's most dramatic example, but he is the show's most consistent reminder that the damage Springfield does to people is not all dramatic. Some of it is quiet. Some of it is the ordinary damage that families do to children when they fall apart, which is no less real for being common. Fat Tony and the Springfield Mafia provide the show's portrait of organized crime as simply another layer of the same institutional structure that Burns represents at the top. Where Burns operates through legal fictions, through corporate structures and regulatory capture, and the economic dependency that his plant creates, Fat Tony operates through the older and more direct mechanism of explicit threat. But the outcome is similar. A shadow government operating parallel to the official one, extracting resources from the community, maintaining its position through a combination of force and the community's preference for not knowing the details of how its more comfortable arrangements are sustained. The fact that Fat Tony and Burns have never been in explicit conflict is notable. Their territories do not seem to overlap in ways that would create friction. They appear to operate in different layers of the same overall structure of control. Burns at the economic and political level, Fat Tony at the street level, each one leaving the other's domain alone because the arrangement is mutually beneficial. Springfield is not a town with a power vacuum at the top. It is a town with a fully occupied power structure at every level, each occupant having found an accommodation with the others that keeps the overall system stable. Mayor Quimby is the political face of this structure. His corruption is so complete and so open that it functions less as a secret and more as a publicly acknowledged fact that nobody acts on, because acting on it would require engaging with the deeper question of why Springfield's political culture has produced Mayor Quimby and continued producing him across decades. The answer to that question leads directly back to the same place every question in Springfield leads: the plant, the contamination, the billionaire who owns both the town's economy and the conditions of its residents' cognition. Political cultures reflect the communities they emerge from. Springfield's political culture has emerged from a community that has been systematically damaged in its capacity for collective action, and the politicians that community produces are the politicians it deserves in the most precise and most uncomfortable sense of that phrase. Mo Sislak is perhaps the show's saddest character, in a category it has never officially recognized as tragic. Mo is the bartender. He tends bar for Homer and his friends. He is part of the social infrastructure of Homer's adult life, in the way that neighborhood bars and the people who run them are part of the social infrastructure of many men's adult lives. He is the constant, the fixture, the person who is always there. And Mo is desperately, chronically, profoundly lonely. The show returns to this with enough regularity that it cannot be accidental. Mo's loneliness is not a subplot or a running gag. It is a sustained character condition, a fundamental feature of who he is, expressed in his inability to maintain romantic relationships, in his complex of insecurities about his own worth, in the specific quality of his presence in the bar, the person who provides community for others while having less of it than anyone around him. He is the center of a social space without being at the center of any social connection. He is present for everyone else's relationships while his own remain inaccessible to him. The bar is Moe's attempt to solve this problem through architecture. If you build a space where people gather, you will be surrounded by people, and being surrounded by people will feel like belonging. And it works. Partially. Homer and Barney and Lenny and Carl do genuinely care about Moe. But caring about Moe in the specific way that regulars care about a bartender is not the same as what Moe needs, which is to be fully seen and fully known by someone who chooses to be with him rather than with his beer. Moe has tried, across the show's run, to find that connection. He has pursued relationships that never worked out. He has presented versions of himself that the world did not receive the way he hoped. He has had his phone number distributed as a crank call target, which the show plays as slapstick, but which means that the most common use of Moe's contact information in Springfield is as a prop for someone else's joke. He is the butt of the gag, and the provider of the space where the gag is planned, and he keeps showing up to open the bar every day regardless. The radiation theory has no specific account of why Moe is lonely, but the systemic account of Springfield does. In a community where cognitive impairment has narrowed the range of available connection, where the population's capacity for sustained emotional engagement has been limited by the same forces that limit their capacity for political engagement, the person who needs genuine deep connection and cannot be satisfied with its simulacrum will always be the loneliest person in the room. Moe needs more than Springfield can give him. Springfield can give him customers. It cannot give him a witness. The Flanders children Rod and Todd are the final piece of the Ned portrait that deserves examination in its own right. They have been raised in the most intentionally wholesome environment that Springfield can produce. Inside the house where goodness is the explicit organizing value, where faith is practiced genuinely rather than as social performance, where the parenting is attentive and loving and sustained. And they are, both of them, profoundly shaped by their father's particular combination of genuine love and psychologically caged expression. They mirror Ned's conditioning in miniature, carefully calibrated responses, instinctive conflict avoidance, a sweetness that comes from genuine character but also from an environment that has made its expectations of sweetness very clear. They lost their mother to a t-shirt cannon at a racetrack because Homer Simpson did not want to catch a t-shirt. They have processed this with the equanimity that their upbringing prepared them for, which is to say they have processed it the way the Flanders household processes everything, through faith and patience and the deliberate cultivation of acceptance. Whether this is health or adaptation is a question the show has never fully resolved. It may be both. What is clear is that Rod and Todd exist in Springfield as evidence that even the most carefully protected childhood in this town carries the weight of everything the town is. They cannot be insulated from the contamination by their father's goodness, any more than Lisa can be insulated from it by her intelligence, or Maggie by her strategic silence. Springfield gets into everything. It is in the air and the water and the specific quality of the community's capacity for justice, which is to say it is in the conditions that shape every life within its borders, regardless of what any individual family does to create a protected space inside those conditions. The supporting cast of The Simpsons is a complete map of American dysfunction, not because the writers were mapping American dysfunction deliberately, although they often were. It is a complete map because any sufficiently detailed fictional community observed across sufficient time will eventually produce a comprehensive account of the social and economic and psychological mechanisms that operate in all communities. The Simpsons has had 36 years to add detail to its map. The detail has accumulated. And what it shows, if you step back far enough to see the whole thing at once, is not a quirky cartoon town. It is a specific and precise diagnosis of what happens to every layer of a community's life when its foundational conditions are wrong. Burns at the top, controlling the energy supply, and therefore the economic dependency, and therefore the political structure. Wiggum in the middle, embodying the failure of accountability that control makes possible. Moe and Apu and Willie and Brockman and Fat Tony and Quimby occupying the different strata of a community that has organized itself around conditions of damage and has found, with genuine ingenuity, ways to build lives and relationships and meaning within those conditions. And the children Bart and Lisa and Maggie and Milhouse and Rod and Todd and Ralph inheriting the structures they were born into, working out what it means to be young and alive inside a town that was broken before they arrived. Every one of them is doing the best they can with what Springfield left them. Every one of them is evidence of something the show has been accumulating across hundreds of episodes. And taken together, their lives constitute the most comprehensive fictional sociology of American community dysfunction that television has ever produced. Not despite being a cartoon, but because being a cartoon gave it the freedom to observe without flinching, to document without the constraints that realistic drama would have imposed, to show you exactly what it is seeing and trust you to understand what you are looking at. Springfield is full of people doing their best inside a broken system. That is not a cartoon observation. That is the most accurate observation about most communities that anyone has ever made. And the fact that it took a yellow-skinned animated family living in a town that does not appear on any map to make it this clearly visible may be the deepest and most honest thing The Simpsons has ever done. Section 14. The Economics of Springfield. How Burns Built a Town That Cannot Afford to Be Free. Everything in Springfield has a price. The electricity comes from the plant. The plant belongs to Burns. Burns sets the terms. This sounds like a simple observation about the economics of a fictional company town, but the implications reach into every corner of Springfield's life in ways that take time to fully appreciate, and that become more important the more you examine the show not as comedy but as economic sociology. A company town is not simply a place where one employer dominates the local economy. It is a place where one employer has sufficient economic power to also dominate the local political, social, cultural, and regulatory environment, because all of those environments are downstream of economic power in ways that only become fully visible when the economic concentration is extreme enough. Springfield is not at the extreme end of company-town dynamics. By the standards of American industrial history, there have been real communities more completely controlled by single employers than Springfield appears to be. But Springfield is extreme enough that the full architecture of company-town dynamics is visible in its social structure, and the show has documented that architecture with more precision than it typically gets credit for. Start with the most basic fact. The plant provides Springfield's electricity. Not some of it, all of it. Burns has no competitors in the local power market. He is the monopoly provider of the resource that every home and business in Springfield requires to function. This means that every household in Springfield sends money to Burns every month, as inevitably as they pay their mortgage or their rent. Burns's revenue stream is not contingent on competition or market dynamics. It is built into the infrastructure of the town itself. He owns the pipes and the wires and the substations that power every light switch and every appliance and every piece of equipment that every person in Springfield uses every day. This creates a dependency that is not economic in any abstract sense. It is physical. The alternative to paying Burns is darkness. It is cold. It is the specific vulnerability that people in communities without independent access to power generation face. You cannot choose a different provider, because there is no different provider. You pay what Burns charges because the alternative is to have no power at all. And having no power is not a choice that families with children and jobs and the basic requirements of modern life can sustainably make. Burns understands this. Burns has always understood this. The plant was not an accidental monopoly, it was a strategic acquisition. And the strategy was precisely this. Control the irreplaceable resource, and you control the community that depends on it, without ever having to explicitly exercise that control. People in communities without power options do not riot. They do not organize. They complain, sometimes loudly, and then they pay the bill, because the alternative is worse than the price. The employment dimension adds a second layer. The plant is Springfield's largest employer. The specific percentage of Springfield's workforce employed directly by the plant varies by episode and by the show's needs for a given story, but it is consistently presented as significant enough that a plant closure or a major reduction in force would produce widespread economic distress in the community. This means that in addition to being the monopoly power provider, Burns is also the largest single source of wage income in the town. People in Springfield pay Burns for their electricity, and they earn their wages from Burns. The money flows in both directions, and both flows run through Burns. This creates a condition that economists who study company towns have documented extensively. The employer becomes the effective government of the community because the employer controls the two most critical variables in most families' economic lives, their income and their essential service costs. When the employer controls both, the power of the formal governmental structure to constrain the employer is severely limited because the employer can adjust either variable in ways that the community cannot afford to resist. Burns does not need to threaten anyone explicitly. The structure of Springfield's economy makes explicit threats unnecessary. Everyone in the town understands, at some level of practical awareness, that the range of actions available to them is constrained by Burns's goodwill in a way that no formal institutional protection can fully override. This is why Wiggum never enforces against the plant. Not because he is personally corrupt, although the show establishes that he is personally corrupt, because enforcing against the plant would have economic consequences for the community that the community's elected officials, including Quimby, would immediately feel pressure to prevent. The political logic runs directly from Burns's economic control to Quimby's governance choices to Wiggum's enforcement priorities. Nobody has to be explicitly told not to investigate the plant. The economic structure of the community creates the decision environment in which not investigating the plant is the rational choice for everyone in the decision-making hierarchy. The German Investors episode is the show's most direct examination of what happens when someone tries to operate the plant outside the specific arrangement Burns has constructed. The new owners were not incompetent. They were actually more competent than Burns in the narrow sense of being more committed to genuine operational management. They fired Homer, which any competent manager would do. They assessed the cost of regulatory compliance, which any responsible owner would do. And the assessment produced a figure that nearly bankrupted them before they could begin. The plant's compliance cost is not simply expensive, it is prohibitive. The only way to operate the plant profitably, given the state it is actually in, is to not comply with safety regulations. The only way to not comply with safety regulations without facing legal consequences is to have a relationship with the regulatory and enforcement environment that prevents those consequences from materializing. That relationship with the local police, the local government, the state regulatory agencies, the federal oversight structure is exactly what Burns has spent a century building. The German investors could not do what Burns does, not because they lacked competence, but because they lacked the specific non-economic assets that Burns has accumulated alongside his economic ones. The relationships, the history, the mutual dependency that makes enforcement against Burns equivalent to shooting the community's economic foundation. They bought the plant, but they could not buy the ecosystem around the plant, and without that ecosystem, the plant was unworkable. Burns bought it back for a fraction of its nominal value because it was, without his specific relationship infrastructure, not worth its nominal value. The economy Burns has built in Springfield is not a side effect of his power. It is the instrument of his power. Every economic relationship in the community runs through him in some way. He has arranged things so that economic dependency flows upward, toward him, constantly, through the mechanisms of utility pricing and wage employment, and the broader economic activity that the plant's existence makes possible. He is not just rich. He is the organizing center of the community's economic life, the sun around which the economic solar system of Springfield rotates. And this economic centrality is what makes every other form of accountability fragile. You cannot effectively regulate an entity on whose goodwill the community's economic life depends. You cannot prosecute an entity whose continued operation is the condition for the continued economic functioning of the community in which the prosecution would occur. You cannot organize political resistance against an entity that employs enough of the community's residents that political resistance might produce the kind of economic anxiety that voters cannot sustain. This is not unique to Springfield. This is the economic logic of every company town that has ever existed, and The Simpsons has dramatized it with a precision that sometimes makes you forget that what you are watching is animation. The specifics are exaggerated. Burns is more cartoonishly evil, the plant is more cartoonishly dangerous, the police are more cartoonishly incompetent, but the underlying dynamics are not exaggerated. They are accurate. They are the economic and political dynamics of captured communities, rendered visible through the clarifying lens of satire. The housing dimension closes the loop in a way that is easy to miss. Springfield's real estate market, to the extent the show has depicted it, is organized around the plant in ways that compound the economic dependency. The neighborhoods closest to the plant, including Evergreen Terrace, where the Simpsons live, are in close enough proximity to the facility that they represent the most economically vulnerable real estate in the community. People who cannot afford to live elsewhere live near the plant. People who cannot afford to move stay near the plant. The physical arrangement of Springfield's residential geography is a direct expression of its economic hierarchy. The people with the fewest economic options are the people most exposed to the plant's contamination, and the people with the most economic options, Burns, who lives in a mansion far from the cooling towers, are the people best insulated from it. This is not a coincidence, and it is not unique to Springfield. The spatial distribution of environmental hazards across economic class lines is one of the most consistently documented findings in environmental sociology. The plant is not randomly located relative to Springfield's residential neighborhoods. Its location relative to those neighborhoods reflects exactly the economic logic that company towns have always expressed in their physical geography. Those who own the hazard live far from it, those who service the hazard live near it, and the relationship between economic position and physical exposure is not incidental but structural. Burns built a town that cannot afford to be free because freedom, in this context, would mean the economic disruption that confronting him would produce. And he built it this way deliberately over a century, through choices that were always about maintaining the specific kind of control that economic dependency creates. The residents of Springfield are not imprisoned. They can leave at any time. But leaving means abandoning their jobs, their homes, their community, their social networks, and the specific web of relationships and obligations that constitute a life. Most people cannot leave. Not because they are physically prevented, but because the cost of leaving is too high, and the alternative staying inside the dependency is sufficiently tolerable that the calculation always resolves the same way. This is the deepest economic truth about Springfield. The town is a trap not because it has bars, but because it has costs. And Burns set those costs deliberately, in full awareness of what he was doing, across enough time that they have become invisible, built into the structure of the community's life so deeply that they no longer feel like costs. They feel like just how things are. Just how things are. In a town where everything is just how things are, the most dangerous question anyone can ask is, why? And Springfield has been very carefully designed to make sure nobody gets there. Section 15. The emotional core. What the Simpsons actually says about love. After all of this, after the radiation and the coma and the unsolved murder and the immortal billionaire and the strategic infant and the exiled mother and the criminalized truth and the false prophecies and the impossible geography and the frozen clocks and the broken supporting characters and the economic captivity after all of it, there is something that none of the theories fully account for and that every attentive viewer has always known. The show is, at its center, about love. Not love in the greeting card sense, not the version of love that exists in the absence of conflict and failure, and the specific grinding difficulty of people who have chosen each other, living together through the full weight of ordinary life. The Simpsons is about love in the harder, more specific, more honest sense. The love that persists through repeated failure, that survives the accumulation of evidence that you are not as good a person as you want to be, that endures the discovery that the people you love are not as good as you wanted them to be, and that continues anyway, because the alternative, not loving these particular imperfect people, is worse than anything the loving costs you. Homer loves his family in ways he cannot always express and often actively undermines. He lies to them, he fails them. He prioritizes his immediate comfort over their longer-term needs, with a consistency that any reasonable accounting would characterize as selfishness. And then he turns around and does something so pure and so unguarded in its love for them that the accounting becomes inadequate, because what he did was not the behavior of a selfish man. It was the behavior of a man who loves his family more than he loves anything else, but who has been so thoroughly damaged by his circumstances that expressing that love in sustained, constructive ways is genuinely beyond his current capability. The show understands this distinction. It has always understood it. The funniest Homer moments and the most moving Homer moments are often the same moments, because the comedy and the pathos arise from the same source, a man with a vast and genuine love, and a severely limited capacity to embody it, trying anyway, failing specifically, and being forgiven not because the failure doesn't matter, but because the love underneath it is too real to dismiss. Marge loves Homer in a way that the show respects enough not to make sentimental. She loves him knowing what he is. She has seen his limitations clearly for decades. She has experienced the specific frustration of being the person who makes everything work in a household where the other adult frequently creates problems rather than solving them. She has had the conversation with herself many times across many seasons about whether this is the life she wants. And she keeps choosing it. Not because she is a saint or because the show has put her in a cage from which she cannot exit, but because what she and Homer have together, this specific, difficult, ridiculous, Genuine connection is the thing she values most in her life. She is not trapped on Evergreen Terrace. She is home on Evergreen Terrace. The distinction matters. Lisa loves Springfield in the way that people love the places that shape them, despite what those places cost them. She sees Springfield clearly. She sees its denial and its contamination and its capacity for collective cruelty toward anyone who insists on the truth. She sees how it has damaged her family, how it has limited her father, how it has constrained her own possibilities. She could let this clear seeing produce contempt. Many people in similar situations develop contempt for the communities they grew up in as a defensive response to the specific pain of caring about something that keeps disappointing you. Lisa does not develop contempt. She develops the more complicated feeling of loving a flawed place fully while refusing to pretend the flaws do not exist. Her advocacy for Springfield, her continued investment in making it better despite its consistent resistance to being made better, is not naive. It is the choice of someone who understands exactly what she is dealing with and chooses to keep caring anyway. Bart loves his family in the specific way of a person who would rather die than admit it. His rebellion is real. His resistance to authority is genuine. His capacity for causing spectacular trouble is not a performance. But underneath all of it is a Bart who needs Homer's approval more than he would ever say out loud, who cares what Lisa thinks of him even when he is being the thing she most disapproves of, who loves Maggie with a protectiveness that emerges in moments of actual threat without any of the ironic distance he maintains the rest of the time. Bart is not a simple character who happens to be funny. He is a child who loves his family more than he knows how to show, living in circumstances that have made showing it feel dangerous, expressing that love through the only register he has been able to sustain, the indirect register of someone who acts out so that the people he loves will keep paying attention to him. And Maggie. We have spent considerable time on Maggie's intelligence and her strategic silence and her extraordinary capabilities. But underneath all of that, underneath the genius and the planning and the careful cultivation of invisibility, is a baby who reaches for her father when he walks in the door. A baby who registers the specific quality of attention that Homer gives her, the specific kind of love that a man who is not always good at love manages to give to the child who requires the least from him in return, and who has built part of herself around the reliability of that love even across the vast uncertainty of everything else in Springfield. The coma theory is devastating in this light. If Homer is dreaming, then the love in the dream is the most true thing in it. The radiation and the contamination and the collective denial and the economics of captivity are the dream's attempt to make sense of conditions that Homer experienced and absorbed before he lost consciousness. But the love he has for Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, and the love they express back toward him across 36 years of episodes, that is not a dream mechanism. That is Homer's deepest truth, his most fundamental reality, the thing his unconscious mind built the dream to sustain and protect, because losing it, even in sleep, would be the loss he could not bear. Every episode ends with the family together. This is not a production convention, or at least it is not only a production convention. Every episode ends with the family together because the show understands, at the level of its most fundamental structure, that this is what it is about. Not the disaster of the week, not the guest star, not the satirical observation or the cultural joke or the topical reference. The family, still together, still on the couch, still in the house on Evergreen Terrace, in the town that cannot be found on any map, in the loop that we built together. The theories ask what is wrong with Springfield. But the show has always known that the question, however interesting, is not the point. The point is that in Springfield, a broken and contaminated and corporately captured and possibly dreamed up and certainly unfindable town, this particular family has managed to love each other through 36 years of everything the town could throw at them. They have been shot at and poisoned and deceived and economically trapped and cognitively impaired and denied the truth about their own history. They have been failed by every institution that was supposed to protect them. They have been used by the most powerful man in town as instruments of his economic control. They have been frozen in time by a force that none of them can name or see. And they are still on the couch, still together, still arguing and forgiving and failing each other and trying again. The theories are right that something is deeply wrong in Springfield. But the show has always been saying something else alongside the wrongness, something the theories are less equipped to address. The something else is this. Love does not require functioning institutions to survive. It does not require a clean environment, or a competent police department, or a billionaire who can be held accountable, or a town that exists on a fixed map. It does not require a coma to end, or a timeline to unfreeze, or a mystery to be solved. It requires apparently only this: a family willing to keep choosing each other despite the accumulation of evidence that everything around them is broken beyond repair. Springfield is broken. It has always been broken. Burns broke it, and the contamination broke it, and the collective denial maintains the brokenness, and the economic captivity makes it expensive to fix. And Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie are on the couch. That is the show. That has always been the show. Every mystery and every theory and every unanswered question we have spent 4 hours with, all of it exists in service of this one central fact: a family in an impossible town, loving each other anyway. We cannot let them go because we love them. Not the way you love a good television program. The way you love people. The way you love the specific, imperfect people who matter most to you, knowing their limitations fully, having experienced their failures directly, choosing them anyway because the love has become part of you, and releasing it would require releasing a version of yourself. You are not ready to give up. The loop is ours. We built it out of love. And we will maintain it for exactly as long as the love asks us to, which, if 36 years is any indication, may turn out to be forever. End of complete script. Final word count: approximately 42,000 plus words across 15 sections and 1 epilogue. Section 16. The Treehouse of Horror. What Springfield looks like when the rules come off. Every October, The Simpsons does something unusual. It steps outside its own reality. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, the annual Halloween anthology installments that began in Season 2 and have continued without interruption ever since, are explicitly non-canonical. The show tells you at the start of each one that what you are about to see does not count. The rules are suspended. The characters can die permanently and then be alive again the following week. The laws of physics do not apply. The social and emotional consequences that govern the regular episodes are absent. This is, the show tells you, a safe space for the impossible. A place where the extreme version of every situation can be explored without the need to clean it up afterward. But what the Treehouse of Horror episodes actually are, examined carefully rather than accepted at face value, is a pressure relief valve. They are the mechanism through which the show processes everything it has accumulated in the regular episodes, but cannot fully express within the constraints of canonical storytelling. The darkness that the main episodes approach and then deflect, the violence and the horror and the existential terror that live underneath every joke in Springfield, find their direct expression in October each year in the specific anthology format that gives the show permission to go where the regular episodes cannot. And the permission reveals something important. The Treehouse of Horror stories are horror stories. Not parody horror, not comedic approximations of horror, but genuine horror stories built on the specific emotional mechanics of dread and violation, and the particular terror of ordinary life turned suddenly, irrevocably strange. The best ones work because they tap into something real beneath the cartoon framing, something that the regular episodes have been gesturing at all along without being able to name it directly. When the Treehouse of Horror gets genuinely scary, and the best ones genuinely do it, is because they are telling you something true about Springfield's actual nature that the regular episodes cannot express within their tonal constraints. Consider the most effective Treehouse of Horror segments across the show's run. They share a common structure. They take a premise that is already latent in regular Springfield and remove the comedy buffer, leaving the underlying reality exposed. The segment where advertisements come to life and attack people is a horror version of the show's normal satirical observations about consumerism. The segment where the Simpsons are transported to a third dimension and the universe they inhabit is revealed to be a thin layer of constructed reality over an incomprehensible void is a horror version of the coma theory. Homer discovers that his world is an artificial construction, and the discovery is terrifying rather than reassuring. The segment based on Poe's The Raven, with Homer as the narrator confronting the bird that will not let him forget his grief, is a horror version of the show's sustained portrait of Homer as a man haunted by loss. The Treehouse of Horror is Springfield with the jokes taken out, and Springfield without the jokes is a horror story. This is not an accident. The show has always known this. The comedy of the regular episodes and the horror of the Halloween episodes are not different things. They are the same material processed through different lenses, producing different emotional effects from the same underlying reality. Homer falling down the stairs is funny. Homer falling down the stairs in a Treehouse of Horror segment, unable to stop falling, falling through the floor and through the earth and into a darkness that has no bottom, is the same physical event transformed into the specific terror of a man who cannot find solid ground. The difference is not in the event. It is in the permission to follow the event to its true conclusion. The regular episodes stop just before that conclusion. They redirect. They find the joke. They use the comedy as a mechanism for processing the horror without fully confronting it, which is exactly what the show says Springfield residents do with every true and difficult thing about their community. The Treehouse of Horror removes the redirect. It says, what if we followed this all the way? What if we did not find the joke? What you find if you follow Springfield's reality all the way without the redirect is genuinely frightening. A man who may have been dreaming for over 3 decades while his family aged without him in the real world. A community poisoned by its own power supply and too cognitively impaired by the poisoning to understand why everyone looks the way they looks. A billionaire so old that he has outlived the normal human scale of consequence, powerful enough to have engineered the destruction of multiple families to protect his economic interests, maintained alive by weekly treatments that have made him dependent on the radiation his plant produces in the same way that a junkie is dependent on the substance that is destroying them. A baby with extraordinary intelligence who has spent her entire life performing helplessness as a survival strategy in a community that would find her capabilities threatening if she revealed them. These are horror premises. They are horror premises that the regular Simpsons has been living inside for 36 years, managing them through comedy, keeping the full weight of them at arm's length through the specific mercy of the joke. The Treehouse of Horror is where the weight lands. And the audience watches? Every October, reliably, for 33 years of Halloween anthology episodes, the audience has tuned in to watch Springfield without its defenses, to experience the reality that the comedy normally mediates made direct and immediate and unavoidable. The ratings for Treehouse of Horror episodes are consistently among the strongest the show produces. People want to see this. People seek it out. They want the version of Springfield that does not protect them from what Springfield actually is. Maybe because what Springfield actually is, the horror story underneath the family comedy, is something they need to see directly, periodically, as a confirmation that they have been reading the subtext correctly all along. The Treehouse of Horror tells the audience, yes, you are right, this is frightening, we see it too, and we are going to spend 22 minutes a year acknowledging it with you before returning to the comedy that makes the other 47 weeks survivable. That is what the Halloween episodes are, not a departure from the show. A confession by the show about what it has been all along. The horror and the comedy are not in tension in The Simpsons. They are two faces of the same observation, that ordinary life in an ordinary community can be, if you look at it honestly enough and long enough, both very funny and genuinely terrifying. That the gap between the surface and the depth, in any sufficiently examined life or community, contains more than it is comfortable to hold. That the reason we tell jokes about hard things is not that the hard things are not hard, but that the jokes make it possible to keep living alongside the hardness without being destroyed by it. Springfield keeps its residents alive through comedy. The Treehouse of Horror tells you what the comedy is protecting them from, and both the comedy and the horror are true. At the same time, about the same place, concerning the same people. That is the oldest truth about storytelling. It is the thing that makes The Simpsons, at its best, more than entertainment. It is what happens when you take a family, put them in an impossible town, surround them with evidence of systemic failure, and then ask, how do people make meaning anyway? How do they love anyway? How do they laugh anyway? And the answer, repeated across 36 seasons and however many episodes we are at now, and all the ones still to come, is, they do. They simply do. Not because the conditions support it, not because the infrastructure of their community has been designed to enable it, not because the billionaire allows it, or the radiation spares it, or the coma ends, or the loop breaks, or the clocks finally start moving again. They do it because that is what people do. The Simpsons, underneath every theory and every mystery and every unanswered question, has always been a sustained argument for this. That the human capacity for love and comedy and meaning-making is not dependent on the conditions being right. It operates in spite of conditions. around conditions, through the gaps in conditions that even the most thoroughly engineered system of control cannot fully close. Burns owns the plant and the electricity and the economic dependency. He does not own what happens on the couch on Sunday night. He does not own the specific quality of feeling that exists in a room where a family watches television together, and one of them laughs at something, and the laugh spreads, and for a moment the room is warm with something that cannot be taxed or regulated or monitored or controlled. That is the thing in Springfield that has no explanation and requires none. That is the thing we came here for. That is why we will come back. Addendum. 36 years of questions that deserve to be named. There is a list that did not fit cleanly into any section, a catalog of mysteries smaller than the ones we spent hours on but no less genuinely unresolved, each one sitting in the margins of Springfield's history like a footnote in a document whose main argument is incomplete without them. They deserve to be named, if not fully addressed. What actually happened to the money that Homer found in the walls of his house and used to fund a recording session? The money appeared, served its narrative purpose, and was absorbed back into the fabric of Springfield without anyone asking where it came from or who it belonged to. In a realistic context, money inside walls suggests previous occupants who did not or could not claim it. The history of the house on Evergreen Terrace and the history of who owned it before The Simpsons has never been addressed. The house is one of the show's most enduring fixtures, the most consistent physical location in the entire series, and its own history is essentially unknown. Who is Patty and Selma's father? The Bouvier family history has been addressed from Marge's perspective across multiple episodes, and the figure of Jacqueline Bouvier, the sister's mother, is a recurring presence in the show. But the sister's father has never appeared and has barely been referenced. In a show that has spent extensive time on the complicated relationship between Homer and his parents, the complete absence of the Bouvier patriarch is a gap that has never been filled. The sisters' particular combination of bitterness and competence has a shape that suggests a specific kind of formative experience, and the experience has never been shown. What is the full history of the Simpson house's position relative to the nuclear plant? Evergreen Terrace is established as close enough to the plant for its contamination to be relevant, but the show has never specified exactly how close or how long the house has been in the family, or who built it and when, or whether the land it sits on has any documented history of contamination before the plant was built. The plant's influence on the neighborhood it occupies is gestured at throughout the series without ever being directly mapped. The identity of the man in the recording booth at the beginning of the opening credits, briefly visible in some versions, has been discussed by fans without ever being officially addressed by the production. He appears for only a moment, in a position that suggests involvement in the musical production that accompanies the credits, and then is gone. The show's opening sequence, which has been analyzed exhaustively for its various variations and surprises, contains at least this one element that has never been definitively explained. What happened to Homer's bowling team? Multiple episodes across the series have established Homer as a passionate recreational bowler with specific connections to the local bowling community, and the bowling alley has appeared as a location with regularity. But the specific continuity of Homer's bowling relationships, the names and fates of his teammates, the history of his competitive record, exists in the same floating state as everything else in Springfield, referenced when useful, abandoned when not, never accumulating into a coherent ongoing narrative. The question of whether Bart's various romantic interests across the show's run have any consistent thread has been discussed in fan communities without resolution. Bart has had multiple crushes and relationships at various points, each one significant within its episode and then absent from subsequent ones. Whether this represents the show's episodic structure absorbing romantic continuity or something more specific about Bart's emotional availability for sustained connection is genuinely unclear. And perhaps most persistently, what does Maggie dream about? The show has depicted other characters' dreams extensively. Homer's dreams are a regular story device, surreal and revealing, and often directly connected to the emotional content of his waking situation. Lisa's dreams have appeared with the same clarity and psychological precision. Even minor characters have had their dreams depicted and examined. Maggie has not. We have extensive evidence of her waking inner life, the planning, the observation, the strategic intelligence that the 36 years of silent presence has revealed in glimpses. But her sleeping mind has never been shown. What does the most intelligent and most strategic member of the Simpson family dream about? What does she see when the performance of helplessness is no longer required? when the room is empty and there is no one to perform for? What version of Springfield does she inhabit when the defenses are down and the unconscious takes over? The show will probably never tell us. It has always understood that Maggie's interior is her own property, more fully than any other character's interior, maintained in privacy with a consistency that the show respects even when it makes her brilliant capabilities visible. What she dreams is the last remaining mystery of the Simpson family, the one that belongs to her alone and that she has never allowed anyone access to. And that, finally, is exactly right. In a show full of mysteries, in a town full of unanswered questions, in a family full of people whose interior lives have been examined and theorized and dissected across 36 years of devoted attention, there should be at least one thing that stays private. At least one thing that the theories cannot reach and the analysis cannot penetrate and the screen cannot show. Maggie's dreams are Springfield's one truly sealed room. And whatever is behind that door, she is keeping it. This script runs to approximately 42,000 words and is optimized for 11 Labs voiceover generation. Paragraph breaks correspond to natural breath points. Section headers can serve as chapter markers for long-form audio production. The tone is consistent throughout. Narrative, unhurried, designed to hold attention through detail and texture rather than escalation. Section 17. The Golden Age and What We Lost. Why seasons 3 through 8 matter more than anything else. Every long-running cultural institution has a golden age. The period when everything came together, the talent, the ambition, the cultural moment, the creative confidence of a team that had found its voice and knew what it was doing and had not yet begun the long, gradual drift away from the thing that made it essential. For The Simpsons, that period is seasons 3 through 8, roughly 1991 through 1997. And the reason those seasons matter so much is not simply that the episodes were better, though they were. The reason they matter is that they establish the standard against which every subsequent episode is measured. A standard so high and so specific that nothing the show has produced since has fully reached it, and nothing the show produces now can reasonably be expected to. Understanding why requires understanding what those seasons were doing, that the seasons before and after were not. The early seasons 1 and 2 were the show finding itself. The animation was rougher, the characterization was less settled, the emotional register was still being calibrated. Homer was sharper-edged and less sympathetic in those early seasons, closer to the villain of the family than to the complicated and loving failure the later seasons established. Bart was the show's initial star, the character the marketing built around, the anarchic center of gravity in a show that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. The early seasons are good. They are not yet great. The Golden Age begins when the show finds the specific combination that made it unlike anything else on television. Genuine satirical ambition paired with genuine emotional warmth, deployed through characters complex enough to carry both without either canceling out the other. The great Golden Age episodes work on multiple registers simultaneously. They are funny in ways that reward both casual attention and close reading. They are emotionally true in ways that the comedy enhances rather than undermines. And they are specifically, precisely observed in their depictions of American life, its economics, its politics, its cultural anxieties, its institutional failures, its domestic textures in ways that the most attentive social satire rarely achieves. Homer the Heretic, from Season 4, is the episode where Homer stays home from church and has the best day of his life, followed by a fire at his house and a rescue performed by his neighbors of different faiths, followed by a conversation with God that manages to be theologically interesting without being either preachy or dismissive. It is funny and warm and genuinely thoughtful about the relationship between institutional religion and personal spirituality, and it manages all three of those things in 22 minutes without any of them feeling rushed or sacrificed for the others. Marge vs. The Monorail, also Season 4, is a pitch-perfect comedy episode whose satirical targets, civic boosters, snake oil salesmen, the specific vulnerability of communities that want to believe someone will solve their problems for them, are managed with such lightness that the criticism never overwhelms the joke. It is one of the funniest episodes the show has ever produced, and also one of its sharpest pieces of social observation, and the two qualities exist in such perfect balance that separating them is practically impossible. Cape Fear, from the same season, is a pure thriller parody that also works as a genuine thriller, the specific quality of sideshow. Bob's menace is real enough that the comedy never fully diffuses the threat, and the threat is never so genuine that it prevents the comedy from landing. The episode walks a line between genres that most shows never attempt, and it walks it with a precision that makes it look easier than it is. Season 5's Rosebud is a meditation on loss and nostalgia, and the specific kind of grief that wealth cannot address, using Mr. Burns's childhood stuffed bear as both comedy prop and genuine emotional center. The episode earns its sentiment because the comedy never sentimentalizes the situation. It observes it with an affection that acknowledges the absurdity without being contemptuous of the feeling underneath. And then there is Homer's triple bypass, and Aunt Maggie Makes Three, and Lisa's Substitute, and the whole run of episodes that manage to take the show's established character dynamics and deepen them, season after season, in ways that made each revisit to a familiar situation feel like a fresh revelation rather than a repetition. The Golden Age ended gradually, as Golden Ages always do. Not all at once, not with any single catastrophic failure, but through the slow accumulation of small choices that individually seemed reasonable and collectively moved the show away from the specific conditions that had made it extraordinary. The writers who had established the voice moved on to other projects. The cultural moment that the show had been the perfect expression of shifted beneath its feet. The demands of producing 22 episodes a season across decades eventually created pressures that the show's ambition could not consistently withstand. And the audience noticed. The internet's endless debate about when The Simpsons peaked, when it started declining, which season represents the last defensible claim to consistent quality. This debate has been ongoing since at least the late 1990s, which means the show's audience recognized the drift while it was still happening and began documenting their response to it in real time. The coma theory offers one framework for understanding this drift as a symptom of something happening within the show's internal reality rather than simply as a production phenomenon. The radiation theory offers another, but the simplest explanation is that the conditions that produced the Golden Age were specific and fragile, and they could not be sustained indefinitely against the pressures of time and commercial necessity. What we lost when the Golden Age ended is not simply good episodes. We lost the specific version of Springfield, that those episodes were building a Springfield that was simultaneously funnier and darker and more emotionally resonant than any cartoon had a right to be. A Springfield that used the specific freedoms of animation to go places that live-action television could not reach. A Springfield that functioned as genuine social criticism without ever abandoning the warmth that made the criticism bearable. That Springfield still exists, preserved in the episodes that produced it, available for anyone who wants to visit it. The later seasons cannot retroactively change what seasons 3 through 8 were. They cannot erase the specific quality of what happened in that room during those years. When a particular combination of writers and animators and voice actors were working at the peak of their collective capability on material that deserved every ounce of that capability. But the Golden Age also clarifies what the mystery of the show's continued existence is really about. The Simpsons we love, the Simpsons that the theories are about, the Simpsons that we cannot let go of is primarily the Simpsons of the Golden Age. The show that has continued since then is a continuation in name and in character and in structure, but it is not the same show. It cannot be the same show. The conditions that made it what it was in those years are gone, and no amount of sustained production can recreate them because conditions are not reproducible. They are of their moment entirely, and when the moment passes, they pass with it. This is why the coma theory is so compelling in its emotional dimensions. If everything since the coma episode is a dream, then the seasons before the coma are the most real thing the show has produced, the grounded, emotionally truthful, family drama in animation that the show was in its first 3.5 seasons, and the increasingly surreal, increasingly disconnected, increasingly impossible post-coma seasons are the dream that imperfectly echoes and extends the reality of the early run. The real Simpsons and the dreaming Simpsons map almost perfectly onto the Golden Age Simpsons and the post-Golden Age Simpsons. Not because the theory is literally true, but because it captures something emotionally accurate about the relationship between what the show was and what it became. We are grieving the Golden Age. We have been grieving it for nearly 30 years. And we continue watching, continue investing, continue maintaining the loop, partly out of hope that the conditions might somehow reconvene, that the right combination of creative will and talent and cultural alignment might produce for even one more season or one more episode, something that reaches the height of what those extraordinary seasons achieved. They probably will not. Not because the people making the show lack talent or ambition, because the golden age was specific to a moment, and moments cannot be recreated, only remembered. And the act of remembering, performed collectively by an audience that has been remembering together for 30 years, is itself a kind of continuation. We carry the golden age with us every time we watch a new episode and measure it against what we remember. We keep the best version of Springfield alive in the act of comparison, in the sustained awareness of what it was. That, too, is a form of love. The love of what something was, maintained faithfully across the distance of what it has become. The Simpsons at its best was one of the greatest things American television has ever produced. The Simpsons, as it currently exists, is something more complicated, a continuation of that greatness sustained through institutional momentum and audience loyalty and the stubborn refusal of the people involved to let the thing end. Both are true, and both are part of why we are still here, 4 hours into Springfield, asking questions that were probably never going to have satisfying answers, because the questions themselves are our way of staying in the conversation with something we love. That is finally what all of this has been, a conversation with something we love. And Springfield cracked cooling towers and all, yellow skin and 4 fingers, and a billionaire who will not die, and a baby who will not speak, and a man who may never wake up from a dream about the family he cannot reach. Springfield has been having that conversation with us, faithfully, every week, for 36 years. It will be here next week, too. It always is.